On the morning of August 31st, 1997, a phone rang inside Balmoral Castle. It was the middle of the night in Paris, but the sun was already climbing over the Scottish hills. The man who answered that call had spent 20 years learning how to deliver difficult news to the most famous woman in the world without ever raising his voice. This time, the news would test everything he had learned. He walked down a corridor he had walked 1,000 times before. Behind one of those doors was Queen Elizabeth II, a woman who had known him since before he could speak. Behind another door, sleeping, were two boys who did not yet know they had lost their mother. The man carrying that knowledge through the castle that morning was not a prince, not an equerry with a famous name, not even a blood relative of the family he served. He was a civil servant with a soft voice and a title most people outside Britain had never heard of: Private Secretary to the Sovereign. His name was Robert Fellowes. For 7 years he had occupied one of the strangest positions in modern royal history. He was the Queen's closest advisor, the man who read her mail, drafted her words, and sat beside her through the worst crises of her reign. He was also, by marriage, the brother-in-law of Diana, Princess of Wales, a woman whose war with the institution he served had defined the entire decade. Two women, one loyal to a crown built on silence and precedent, one determined to be heard on her own terms, no matter what it cost her. Fellowes did not choose this position because he wanted power. He inherited trust before he understood what it meant. Born on royal land, to a family that had served that land for generations, held as an infant by a teenage princess who would one day become his employer. Nobody engineered his rise. It happened slowly, through decades of quiet competence, until one day he found himself standing at the exact point where family loyalty and institutional duty were about to collide in front of the entire world. What did he know, and when did he know it? What did he choose to tell the Queen, and what did he choose to leave out when it came to Diana? Was he the man who protected the monarchy from collapse during its darkest decade, or was he, in the eyes of his own sister-in-law, one of the people who helped push her out? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This is the story of a man almost nobody remembers by name, who stood closer to the center of the 20th century's most public family collapse than almost anyone alive. 9 years inside the private secretary's office, 3 royal divorces, a fire that nearly destroyed a castle, a funeral that stopped a nation, and through all of it, one man walking a line between the family he served and the family he married into, trying not to fall on either side. He rarely gave interviews. He almost never explained himself in public. For most of his life, Fellowes let the institution he served speak for him, which meant that when the story of Diana's final years came to be written, it was written mostly by people who had every reason to see him as an obstacle, a gatekeeper, or worse. To understand what actually happened inside those palace walls between 1990 and 1997, you have to start decades earlier, in a place far from London, on land that had belonged to the crown for longer than anyone in his family could remember. Robert Fellowes was born on December 11, 1941, on the grounds of Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, in the middle of a war that had already reshaped the world he was entering. His father, Major Sir William Fellowes, served as land agent for the royal family's private estate, managing thousands of acres of farmland, woods, and tenant properties on behalf of the monarchy. It was not a ceremonial position. A land agent negotiated tenancy agreements, oversaw crop yields, managed the gamekeepers who maintained Sandringham's famous shooting grounds, and answered directly to the reigning monarch on questions of how the estate's finances were run. Someone had to keep Sandringham running, season after season, harvest after harvest, and for the Fellowes family, that job had become something close to a hereditary calling, passed down with the same seriousness other families reserved for a title or a peerage. The Fellowes name itself carried old roots in Norfolk, tracing back to the village of Shottisham, a lineage of landed gentry connected, through a distant common ancestor, to the barons de Ramsay. It was respectable, established, comfortably wealthy by the standards of rural England, but it was not aristocracy in the way the Spencers or the Windsors were aristocracy. That distinction, subtle but real, would shape how Robert Fellows understood his own position for the rest of his life. He belonged to the world of the crown, without belonging to the crown itself, close enough to see everything, and far enough to never forget his place. The estate itself was more than a piece of land. Sandringham had been a royal retreat since the 1860s, purchased by Queen Victoria for her son, the future Edward VII, and by the time Fellows was born, it had become the place where the family gathered every Christmas, walked its game-filled grounds every winter, and escaped the formality of London whenever the calendar allowed. The people who worked its grounds occupied an unusual space in the social order. They were not aristocrats in the way the Spencers or the Windsors were aristocrats. They were something more specific, a class of trusted stewards who lived alongside royalty without ever quite belonging to it, generation after generation, learning the family's habits and expectations the way one learns a second language spoken only at home. Being born on royal land during wartime carried its own particular texture. Britain in December 1941 was a country of blackout curtains and rationing books, a country that had just watched Pearl Harbor pull the United States into a war that had already stretched British families thin for 2 years. Sandringham itself was not immune to the conflict, its grounds requisitioned in places for agricultural production, its usual rhythms disrupted by a war that touched every corner of the country, including the private retreats of kings. Robert Fellows entered the world in the middle of all of it, the son of a man whose job was to keep the estate functioning no matter what else was happening beyond its gates. Within days of his birth, a visitor came to see him that few infants ever receive. Princess Elizabeth, then a teenager and heir presumptive to the throne, was staying nearby and came to see the newborn son of her family's land agent. Decades later, by then queen for longer than most of her subjects had been alive, she would joke that Robert Fellows was the only one of her private secretaries she had ever held in her arms as a baby. It sounds like the kind of detail royal biographers love to repeat at dinner parties. It also happens to be true, and it says something important about how differently Fellows entered royal service compared to almost everyone else who ever held his job. He did not have to prove himself worthy of trust from a stranger. He had to grow into a trust that already existed before he had any say in the matter. His childhood ran on the rhythms of an estate built to serve a family that was not, strictly speaking, his own family, and yet somehow was. He attended Eton College, the same institution that had shaped generations of British establishment men before him, absorbing the particular blend of restraint, confidence, and social fluency that Eton was designed to produce. Away from the classroom, he found an outlet in cricket, good enough by the end of the 1950s to play for Norfolk in the Minor Counties Championship, turning out against Buckinghamshire and Nottinghamshire's second team. It was a minor achievement in the grand sweep of his life, but it fit a pattern that would define him for decades. Competent, unshowy, willing to put in the work without needing anyone to notice. Years later, reflecting on the path that took men like him into royal service, Fellows would describe the route with unusual honesty for a courtier. Family connections, Eton, the city, the guards, he said, tracing the well-worn pipeline that had funneled young men of a certain background into royal service for generations. Quite a gilded cage, he admitted, acknowledging without much self-pity that his life had followed a track laid down long before he had the freedom to choose a different one. From Eton, in 1960, he went straight into the Scots Guards on a short service commission, the standard next step for young men of his background who were expected to serve a few years in uniform before moving into civilian careers that mattered more to the family's long-term position. It was a world of parade grounds and inspections, of drill sergeants who cared nothing for a young man's family name, and of the particular discipline that came from learning to give and take orders inside a rigid chain of command. Whatever ease Fellows had grown up with at Sandringham, the Guards stripped away the illusion that birth alone earned respect. The Guards gave him structure, 3 years of military life, precise and hierarchical, before his commission ended in 1963, and he faced a decision that had nothing to do with palaces at all. He chose banking. Fellows joined Allen Harvey and Ross, a firm of discount brokers and bankers in the City of London, and for the next 14 years, he built a career entirely separate from the world he had been born into. Discount houses occupied a peculiar and now largely vanished corner of British finance, trading short-term government and commercial debt, acting as a buffer between the Bank of England and the wider money markets. It was unglamorous, technical work, learned through years of watching interest rates move and understanding how liquidity flowed through a financial system that still ran, in the 1960s, on handshakes as much as paperwork. Fellows learned the mechanics of it all, the churn of London's money markets, eventually rising to managing director. This detail matters more than it might first appear. When people later described Fellows as a lifelong courtier, born to serve and shaped by nothing else, they skipped over something important. For the better part of 2 decades, he was not a courtier at all. He was a city banker with a demanding job, a mortgage to think about, and a professional identity built entirely apart from his family's historic ties to the crown. He commuted into London, like thousands of other men his age, sat through the same market pressures, and answered to shareholders and clients, rather than a monarch. The palace noticed him anyway. In 1974, Buckingham Palace offered him a position in the royal household. He turned it down. His firm was going through a difficult period financially, and Fellows felt he could not walk away from his colleagues and responsibilities at that particular moment, whatever the prestige of the alternative on offer. It would be easy to read this as false modesty, the kind of story courtiers tell afterward, to make themselves sound reluctant and dutiful, rather than ambitious. But the timeline argues against that reading. A man chasing royal proximity for its own sake does not say no to Buckingham Palace, and then wait 3 more years for a better moment to arrive. Fellows came from a family that understood royal service as a genuine obligation carried out at the right time, not a prize to be seized the instant it was dangled in front of him. 3 years later, in 1977, the circumstances had changed, and Fellows accepted a position as assistant private secretary to the sovereign. He was 35 years old, walking into an institution with roots stretching back to 1805, when the role of private secretary to the sovereign was first created under King George III, and filled by a soldier named Herbert Taylor. By the time Fellows arrived a century and 3/4 later, the office had evolved into the operational center of the monarchy's relationship with the outside world, and it carried a peculiar kind of authority that came from proximity rather than election. The private secretary serves as the main channel of communication between the monarch and the government, manages the sovereign's official correspondence and daily program, and coordinates the countless relationships the crown maintains with the armed forces, the church, and hundreds of charitable and civic organizations of which the sovereign is patron. It is one of the most influential unelected positions in the United Kingdom, and almost nobody outside a narrow circle of politicians and journalists has ever heard the names of the men who have held it. Fellows was about to become one of only a handful of people in the country who would see every difficult letter, every draft speech, every private worry that crossed the monarch's desk. Fellows spent the next 22 years of his professional life inside that office, and the culture of the place demanded a particular kind of patience that had nothing in common with the pace of the banking world he had just left. Advancement did not come from bold moves or public visibility. It came from accumulated trust, built through thousands of small, careful decisions made away from any camera, decisions nobody outside a handful of rooms in Buckingham Palace would ever know had been made at all. He served as assistant private secretary from 1977 to 1986, working first under Sir Philip Moore and then observing the transition to Sir William Heseltine, an Australian who had made his own unlikely journey from a small town outside Perth to the innermost circle of the British monarchy. Heseltine's rise was, in its own way, just as improbable as anything that would later happen to Fellows, a reminder that the palace's inner circle was not entirely closed to men without generations of English pedigree behind them, provided they had earned the trust required to enter it. Heseltine became a mentor of sorts, someone Fellows studied closely as he absorbed the unwritten rules of the job. How to phrase a difficult recommendation to the sovereign without ever appearing to overstep. How to manage government ministers who wanted more from the palace than the palace was willing to give. How to say no without ever appearing to have said no at all. A skill that would matter more to Fellows than he could possibly have anticipated in his first years on the job. He watched Heseltine navigate the day-to-day friction between Downing Street and the palace, watched him draft statements that had to satisfy a monarch, a government, and a public all at once, and slowly built the same instincts in himself. While his professional life unfolded at this careful, institutional pace, his personal life took a turn that would eventually tangle his career and his family together in ways nobody at the time could have predicted. In April 1978, Fellows married Lady Jane Spencer at the Guards Chapel in London, a wedding that brought together two families already woven into the fabric of the British establishment. Jane was the eldest daughter of Earl Spencer, part of one of England's oldest and most storied aristocratic families, a lineage that included royal blood of its own, running back centuries and estates that had hosted monarchs for generations. It was, by the standards of that world, an entirely appropriate match, a rising young courtier from a family long trusted by the crown, marrying into one of the great houses of the English peerage. Fellows was, at the time of the wedding, still an assistant private secretary, a young man on the way up, but not yet the figure of significant institutional weight he would later become. Among the bridesmaids at that wedding stood a teenager, barely 17 years old, the youngest of the Spencer sisters. Her name was Diana. She was, at that point, entirely unremarkable to anyone outside her own family and social circle, a shy young woman, a few years away from working at a London kindergarten, and living a life defined by nothing more dramatic than the ordinary concerns of an aristocratic girl not yet out in society. She had grown up not far from Sandringham herself, at Park House, a property her family rented on the same royal estate where Fellows had been born, which meant that in one form or another, the paths of these two people had been running parallel for years, before either of them understood what that would eventually mean. Nobody in that chapel in April 1978 could have imagined that within 3 years, this same teenage bridesmaid would become the most photographed woman on earth, engaged to the heir to the throne, and that the man marrying her sister that day would one day sit at the Queen's side, advising the monarch on the unraveling of that very marriage. The wedding itself was, by royal adjacent standards, a relatively contained affair, nothing close to the spectacle that would surround Diana's own wedding 3 years later. But it mattered enormously for what it set in motion. Fellows had married into the Spencer family at the exact moment their youngest daughter was still an unknown quantity to the wider world. He had no way of anticipating that his sister-in-law would soon become the central figure in a story that would consume the monarchy, the British press, and eventually his own career, for the better part of 2 decades. Fellows continued to rise through the private secretary's office at the same measured pace that had defined his entire career. In 1986, he was promoted to deputy private secretary, working directly under Heseltine and taking on greater responsibility for managing the operational demands of the monarch's daily life. The 1980s were, in many ways, a deceptively calm decade for the institution he served. The public still largely saw the royal family as a source of stability rather than spectacle. Diana had married Charles in 1981, in a wedding watched by an estimated global audience of hundreds of millions, and for the first several years afterward, the cracks in that marriage remained hidden from all but a small circle of family and staff. Fellows, by then bound to that family both professionally and through marriage, was part of the small circle that could see what the public could not. Colleagues who worked alongside him during these years consistently described the same qualities: steadiness under pressure, a preference for quiet persuasion over confrontation, and an unusual willingness, for a man of his background, to question tradition when tradition no longer served the institution's interests. He was not a revolutionary. He did not believe in dramatic, showy gestures, and he never sought credit publicly for the changes he pushed through privately. But he was, in the words of those who watched him operate closely, gently innovative, someone capable of nudging an institution built on centuries of habit towards small, meaningful changes without ever appearing to challenge its authority. That instinct, patient and unshowy, would come to define almost everything he did once he reached the top of the office, though in 1986, nobody yet knew how badly that instinct would be tested. By 1990, when Heseltine announced his retirement and prepared to return to his native Australia, the choice of successor had become, in the eyes of most people inside the palace, close to inevitable. Robert Fellows had spent 13 years proving himself inside an office that measured trust in decades rather than years, and there was no obvious rival with either his experience or his standing. On October 19, 1990, Queen Elizabeth II appointed him private secretary to the sovereign, the most senior civilian position in the entire royal household. He was sworn into the Privy Council, granted the honorific, the Right Honourable for life, and became, in practical terms, the single most influential unelected advisor to the British monarch, the man whose desk every difficult decision would eventually cross. The appointment placed him in a lineage stretching back nearly 2 centuries, joining the small roster of men who had stood at the monarch's side during the defining crises of their respective eras. Alan Lascelles had guided King George VI and then the young Queen Elizabeth through the uncertain early years of her reign. Michael Adiane and Martin Charteris had each managed their own share of institutional turbulence. Fellows now inherited not just their office and their title, but the unspoken expectation that he would prove equal to whatever tested him next, in an era when the press scrutinized the royal family with an intensity none of his predecessors had faced. It was, on paper, the natural culmination of a career built with extraordinary patience over 13 years. Fellows had done everything correctly. He had waited for the right moment to join the household, worked his way up through careful, incremental promotions, and earned a position that few men in Britain would ever hold. Photographs from that period show a tall, bespectacled figure standing a respectful half-step behind the Queen, a man who had trained his entire adult life to be present without being conspicuous. Those who worked with him during this period noted that he carried the appointment without visible pride, treating it less as a personal victory and more as a responsibility that had simply arrived at its proper time, the way a harvest arrives at the end of a season, regardless of how the farmer feels about it. There was also a quieter irony sitting underneath the appointment, one that few commentators at the time thought to mention. Fellows was not only related to Diana through his marriage to Jane. His mother's family connected him, at a further remove, to the Fergusons, which made him a first cousin of Ronald Ferguson, father of Sarah, Duchess of York, who had married Prince Andrew in 1986. By 1990, Robert Fellows sat at the professional centre of an institution that was, through his own bloodline and marriage, also becoming his extended family, in an almost claustrophobic sense. 2 of the young royal wives whose marriages would soon dominate British headlines, Diana and Sarah, were connected to him by blood or marriage before either woman had said a single word in public about the pressures closing in on her. This tangle of family and duty was not unique to Fellows inside the palace, but it was unusually dense in his particular case, and it meant that when trouble arrived, he would not be able to treat it as an abstract institutional problem to be managed from a comfortable distance. Every difficult conversation about Diana's unhappiness, every leaked story about the state of her marriage, every request from Buckingham Palace to manage the fallout, would eventually pass across the desk of a man who saw Diana not just as the Princess of Wales, but as his own wife's younger sister, someone he had watched grow from a shy teenage bridesmaid into the most scrutinized woman in the world. What he could not have known, standing in Buckingham Palace on the day of his appointment, was how quickly his professional triumph would collide with his own family. Within months of taking the post, the marriage between his sister-in-law Diana and Prince Charles, already fraying behind closed doors for years, would begin sliding toward a public collapse unlike anything the modern monarchy had ever faced. Fellows had spent his entire adult life mastering the art of institutional discretion, learning to serve the crown without ever letting personal feeling show. He was about to discover that discretion has limits when the person at the center of the unfolding crisis is family, and when the whole world is watching, waiting to see whose side he takes. By the start of 1992, Robert Fellows had been private secretary to the sovereign for a little over a year, and he had already learned that the job rarely allowed for a gentle introduction. What he could not have predicted, sitting down at his desk in Buckingham Palace that January, was that he was about to live through 12 months that would later be remembered as the single worst year of Queen Elizabeth's 40-year reign, a year in which 3 of her children's marriages would collapse in public, one of her official residences would nearly burn to the ground, and his own sister-in-law would become the author of a book that pulled the Windsors' private failures into full daylight. The first blow landed in March. Prince Andrew, the Queen's second son, separated from his wife Sarah, Duchess of York, ending a marriage that had begun with genuine public affection in 1986 and had steadily deteriorated under the same pressures of scrutiny and isolation that were already straining Charles and Diana's union. The announcement itself broke with tradition in a way that revealed just how strained the palace's usual approach to family crisis had become. Rather than the vague, formulaic language courtiers typically used to describe royal marital trouble, the statement went further, noting that the Queen found the timing undesirable, given that it landed in the middle of a general election campaign, an unusually candid admission of institutional irritation from a family that had spent generations perfecting the art of saying nothing at all. For Fellows, this separation carried a personal weight beyond the professional one. Sarah's father, Ronald Ferguson, was his own first cousin, which meant that within a matter of weeks, two branches of his extended family, the Spencers through his wife and the Fergusons through his mother, were both at the center of very public royal marriage failures. He was advising the Queen on a crisis involving people he had known at family gatherings his entire life, sitting in meetings where the language of official statements had to be weighed against his own private knowledge of what these marriages had actually looked like from the inside. Few people in the room understood, as he did, just how much strain both young women had described feeling under the weight of royal expectation long before either separation reached the newspapers. A month later, in April, Princess Anne's divorce from Captain Mark Phillips was finalized, a marriage that had been quietly unraveling for years and drew comparatively little public sympathy, given how openly both parties had already moved on with new partners. Still, it added a third strand to a pattern that was becoming impossible for the press or the public to ignore. 3 of the Queen's 4 children were now divorced or separated, and the year had barely reached its 4th month. Inside the private secretary's office, the mood shifted from managing isolated incidents to something closer to crisis planning, an ongoing effort to protect an institution that suddenly looked far more fragile than it had a decade earlier. Fellows began holding more frequent private meetings with the Queen during this period, briefings that colleagues remembered as noticeably longer and more serious in tone than the routine daily updates that had characterized his first year in the role. Then came June, and with it, the event that would test Fellows more directly than anything that had come before. Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story, a biography that laid bare the private anguish Diana had experienced throughout her marriage to Charles. The book described her sense of rejection within the royal family, her long struggle with bulimia, and disclosed that she had attempted suicide multiple times during the 1980s, details the public had never been permitted to see behind the composed, glamorous images that filled the tabloids. It portrayed a young woman who had entered marriage into one of the most scrutinized institutions on earth, with almost no preparation for what awaited her, surrounded by a household of courtiers whose first loyalty was to the institution rather than to her personal well-being. What made the book seismic inside the palace was not simply its content. It was the growing realization, confirmed only years later, but suspected almost immediately by insiders, that Diana herself had secretly cooperated with Morton, feeding him information through a trusted intermediary, her friend Dr. James Coldhurst, rather than speaking to the author directly. This arrangement allowed her to publicly deny involvement in the book, while ensuring the world finally heard her side of the story, told in her own words, even if filtered through another voice. When Buckingham Palace's press office initially treated the book as unauthorized tabloid speculation, dismissing its claims as the product of disgruntled former staff, they had no idea they were effectively calling their own princess a liar without knowing it, a position that would become deeply embarrassing once the truth eventually surfaced. For Fellows, this put him in an almost impossible position. He was the Queen's chief advisor, obligated to protect the institution and counsel the monarch on how to respond to a devastating breach of the family's usual code of silence. He was also Diana's brother-in-law, married to her sister, a man who had watched her grow up and who understood, better than almost anyone else inside the palace walls, the loneliness and structural isolation she had described in the book. Colleagues who observed him during this period noted that he never allowed his personal sympathy for Diana to visibly compromise his professional counsel to the Queen, but the tension of holding both positions at once, loyal advisor and worried relative, was evident to those who worked closest to him. 2 months later, in August, the year delivered another blow, this time landing on the Fergusons. The Daily Mirror published photographs of Sarah, Duchess of York, sunbathing topless, while her financial advisor kissed her feet, images captured with a long lens while she was on holiday in France, that dominated front pages for days and further eroded public confidence in the family's dignity. That same week, transcripts began circulating from a recorded phone conversation between Diana and a friend named James Gilby, a tape that had apparently been intercepted years earlier, in the closing days of 1989, and was now finding its way into print after sitting unpublished for nearly 3 years. It revealed an intimacy and vulnerability in Diana's private life that had never been intended for public consumption. The tabloids seized on it immediately, and the story became known within days by a nickname, borrowed from an affectionate term used in the recording, that would follow Diana for years. Nobody inside the palace ever fully established who had recorded the call or how it had reached the newspapers, a mystery that added another layer of paranoia to an institution already struggling to trust its own walls. By November, it might have seemed as though the year had exhausted its capacity for disaster. It had not. On the morning of November 20th, a fire broke out in Queen Victoria's private chapel inside Windsor Castle, reportedly ignited when a spotlight used to illuminate a curtain during renovation work set the fabric alight. Within minutes, the blaze had spread beyond control, and it would take more than 200 firefighters and 15 hours of continuous effort to finally extinguish it. By the time the flames were out, roughly a fifth of the castle, including St. George's Hall, lay in ruins. The fire itself, in the hours before anyone understood its financial or political consequences, was simply a disaster to be survived. Fellows was among the officials who rushed to the castle as the blaze spread through the northeast wing. The Queen herself went into her private apartments to help retrieve paintings and treasured objects before the fire reached them, an image that stayed with the small group of aides who witnessed it. When she later greeted a group of aides back at Buckingham Palace, visibly exhausted, she managed to find something close to humor in the wreckage, noting simply that at least they had saved some of the pictures. The fire triggered a controversy nobody inside the palace had anticipated, as officials began totaling the cost of restoration, estimated eventually at close to £37 million. Questions arose in Parliament and the press about who should pay for it. Members of Parliament who had stayed quiet about royal finances for years suddenly found a receptive public audience for questions about why an institution that paid no income tax should expect ordinary citizens to fund its repairs. It was in the aftermath of this specific controversy that Fellows played one of his most consequential and least publicly credited roles. He was among the small circle of advisors who pushed the Queen toward 2 significant reforms, beginning to pay income tax on her personal wealth for the first time in nearly a century, and opening the staterooms of Buckingham Palace to paying visitors during the summer months to help fund the Windsor restoration. Some of the Queen's more traditional advisors viewed the proposals as a dangerous concession to public pressure. Fellows argued the opposite, that refusing to adapt would leave the institution looking indifferent to the very taxpayers whose goodwill it depended on. Both changes eventually happened, and both are remembered by royal historians as early instances of Fellows nudging a resistant institution toward the kind of modernization it would need to survive the coming decades. 3 days after the Queen personally toured the wreckage of Windsor Castle, she delivered a speech at London's Guildhall, marking the 40th anniversary of her accession to the throne. Speaking with a rawness that surprised even seasoned royal correspondents, she said that 1992 was not a year she would look back on with undiluted pleasure, borrowing a phrase from a sympathetic letter she had received to describe it as her annus horribilis. Few in the audience that day fully appreciated how much of the speech's careful tone bore the fingerprints of the man standing quietly in the background of the Queen's public life throughout that year. The final and most consequential blow arrived less than 3 weeks later. On December 9, 1992, the government formally announced in the House of Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales were separating. For Fellows, This announcement represented the culmination of everything he had been managing since taking office 2 years earlier, the moment when the private tensions he had watched unfold within his own extended family became, irreversibly, a matter of state. The days leading up to that announcement required a level of coordination that tested every skill Fellows had spent 15 years developing inside the private secretary's office. He had to help manage communication between Buckingham Palace, the Prince of Wales's separate household at St James's Palace, and Downing Street, ensuring that Prime Minister John Major's statement to Parliament aligned precisely with the language the palace wanted used. A phrase that leaned too sympathetically toward Diana risked alienating Charles and the traditionalists who surrounded him. A phrase that seemed to protect the institution at Diana's expense risked feeding the narrative, already gaining strength in tabloid coverage, that the palace machine had closed ranks against an outsider who had never truly been accepted. There was also the delicate matter of the children. William was 10 years old at the time of the separation announcement, Harry only 8, and part of Fellows's role involved thinking through how the formal machinery of state would intersect with the private reality of two young boys learning that their parents' marriage had publicly ended. Fellows carried this negotiation while managing his own complicated position within it. He was Charles's institutional advisor, obligated to a degree of loyalty to the heir to the throne above all other family members. He was simultaneously Diana's brother-in-law, a man whose own wife had grown up alongside her younger sister. People who worked alongside him during this period would later describe him as someone who managed to remain civil and useful to both sides of an increasingly bitter divide, a rare achievement given how quickly the Wales's separation was hardening into two competing camps, each briefing friendly journalists, each building a public case for why the marriage had failed and whose fault it truly was. By the time 1992 finally ended, Robert Fellows had spent his first full year as private secretary, managing a level of institutional crisis that none of his predecessors had faced in a single 12-month span. 3 broken marriages, a devastating fire, a tell-all biography written with his own sister-in-law's secret cooperation, a leaked phone call that had turned Diana's private vulnerability into tabloid entertainment, and now, officially, the separation of the future King of England from the mother of his heirs. Friends and colleagues later described him as visibly thinner and more drawn by the end of that year, a private toll matching the public one carried by the family he served. What almost nobody outside the palace understood at the time was that the hardest part of his job was only beginning. The separation of December 1992 did not end the conflict between Diana and the institution Fellows served. It simply moved that conflict into a new and more dangerous phase, one in which Diana would begin to speak more openly than any royal figure in modern British history ever had, and in which Robert Fellows would find himself increasingly cast, in Diana's own eyes, and in the eyes of many who sympathized with her, not as a neutral relative caught in the middle, but as one of the palace figures working against her. The separation announced in December 1992 was supposed to bring a measure of clarity to a situation that had grown unbearable for everyone involved, the Queen included. Instead, 1993 opened with a scandal that made the previous year's turmoil look almost tame by comparison, and it landed squarely on Prince Charles rather than Diana, a reversal that briefly shifted the balance of public sympathy in a way nobody inside the palace had anticipated. In mid-January, British tabloids published transcripts of a recorded telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, a call that had actually taken place back in December 1989, years before the separation, while Charles was still legally and publicly married to Diana. An amateur radio enthusiast had apparently intercepted the call using a scanning device, and the recording sat unused for years before finding its way first to an Australian magazine, and then, within days, to the British press. The conversation was intimate and unguarded in a way that mortified both participants once it became public, confirming beyond any remaining doubt what much of Britain had already suspected, that Charles's relationship with Camilla had continued, secretly, throughout his marriage to Diana. The tabloids gave the story a nickname within hours, one that stuck for the rest of the decade, and by the time the coverage crested, Camilla and her own husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, had separated as well. The scandal exposed something uncomfortable about the modern monarchy, that Fellows and his colleagues had spent years trying to manage quietly. The royal family's communications were not secure, had perhaps never been fully secure, and the same technology that let ordinary Britons eavesdrop on cordless and early mobile telephone signals could apparently pick up conversations meant for nobody but the two people speaking. Questions swirled for months about who had actually recorded the call and how it had sat undiscovered for 4 years before surfacing at the exact moment it would cause maximum damage. Questions that were never conclusively answered. The scandal also forced a more immediate and practical set of decisions onto Fellows' desk. Government ministers wanted assurance that the monarchy's constitutional standing was not being threatened by the personal conduct of its future king, and journalists pressed the palace's press office for comment in numbers that overwhelmed the small team responsible for managing royal communications. Fellows found himself coordinating an official response that tried to draw a line between the institution of the crown, which had to be protected regardless of individual failings, and the private conduct of the man who would one day inherit it, a distinction that proved far easier to state in a briefing document than to maintain in the face of relentless press coverage. For Fellows, the fallout from this scandal required an entirely different kind of management than the crises of 1992. This was not a story about Diana's unhappiness or her allies leaking sympathetic material to the press. This was a scandal that damaged the heir to the throne directly. Fellows had to help the Queen and her senior advisors decide how much distance to publicly place between the monarchy and Charles's private conduct, all while managing the reality that Diana, watching from the sidelines, now held a form of public sympathy that made her, for the first time, more popular with the British public than her estranged husband. Opinion polls conducted in the weeks after the scandal broke showed Diana's approval ratings climbing, even as Charles's fell. Inside the palace, some officials began to worry that Diana's growing popularity, however earned, was becoming a genuine problem for the institution's stability. Through the spring and summer of 1993, Diana's public role grew increasingly strange and uncertain. She was no longer fully inside the machinery of royal life, since her separation from Charles had already begun stripping away many of the formal duties and protections that came with being the wife of the heir apparent. But she was not yet free of it either. She continued high-profile charity work, particularly her visits to AIDS hospices, at a time when the disease still carried enormous public stigma, work that saw her photographed holding the hands of dying patients without gloves, a small gesture that did more to shift public attitudes toward AIDS in Britain than years of government health campaigns. This period also marked the beginning of her engagement with landmine survivors, a cause that would eventually define much of her later public identity. This humanitarian turn did not go unnoticed inside the palace, and it complicated the institution's relationship with Diana in ways that pure scandal management never could. Fellows and his colleagues could not simply treat her as a liability to be contained when she was simultaneously doing more than any other member of the royal family to modernize its public image. Some inside the household privately acknowledged that Diana's instinct for this kind of work was years ahead of anything the rest of the family had attempted, an uncomfortable truth for an institution that prided itself on setting the standard for public service rather than following someone else's lead. But behind this public composure, those closest to her described a woman increasingly convinced that she was being watched, undermined, and quietly pushed toward the exits by people inside the institution who no longer wanted her there. Her protection officer at the time, Inspector Ken Worf, later described March 1993 as an especially dark stretch for Diana, recounting one incident during a skiing trip in Austria when he discovered, after a heavy overnight snowfall, footprints and an impression in the snow beneath her hotel balcony, suggesting she had jumped roughly 20 feet from the room above, rather than use the door. The incident was never fully explained publicly, but it left Worf deeply concerned for her well-being, at a moment when the institution around her seemed largely focused on managing her public image rather than her private state of mind. Some of that paranoia had a basis in fact. Diana's telephone conversations had already been intercepted once, in the Gilby tape scandal the previous year. Now, in the aftermath of the Camillagate revelations, an atmosphere of suspicion settled over the entire royal family. Diana increasingly confided in a small, shifting circle of trusted friends and staff, including Worf himself, who had guarded her since 1987 and had become one of the few people she trusted with what she was actually feeling, rather than what she was expected to project in public. That trust made Worf's resignation in November 1993 a significant blow. His departure, following internal tensions within the Royal Protection Command structure, left Diana without one of her few remaining sources of consistent, personal stability. The timing compounded the difficulty. That same month, the Daily Mirror published photographs of Diana exercising in a gym, taken secretly from an angle designed to embarrass rather than inform. Diana reportedly felt a particular sense of betrayal over the gym photographs, having believed the environment was private and secure, and the episode reinforced her growing conviction that no space in her life could be trusted to remain private for long. Weeks later, in early December, Diana stunned an audience at a charity luncheon by announcing that she intended to withdraw substantially from public life, telling the crowd she needed time and space away from the constant pressure of media attention that had followed her for more than a decade. It was, in effect, a public admission that the isolation she had described privately to friends had become unsustainable. For fellows, Diana's withdrawal speech created an unusual dilemma. On one hand, her retreat from public duties reduced some of the day-to-day friction between her office and the palaces. On the other hand, it removed one of the last remaining threads still connecting Diana to the structured, protected world of official royal life, a world that, whatever its frustrations, had also provided her with a formal role, official protection, and staff paid for by the Crown. Those who worked alongside fellows during this period noted his private concern that Diana's isolation, both emotional and institutional, was deepening rather than easing. The following year, 1994, brought a development that reshaped public understanding of the entire Wales marriage. In a television documentary and accompanying biography by Jonathan Dimbleby, Charles admitted publicly, for the first time, that he had been unfaithful to Diana during their marriage. The admission was carefully framed, timed to coincide with the publication of a book intended to rehabilitate Charles's public image by explaining the pressures of his own upbringing. It succeeded only partially. Public reaction skewed heavily towards sympathy for Diana. The Dimbleby project also revealed the extent to which both sides of the Wales marriage had, by 1994, begun treating their private lives as material for public rehabilitation campaigns, a strategy that struck many longtime royal watchers as a fundamental departure from everything the institution had traditionally stood for. Previous generations of the royal family had weathered scandal through silence and patience. Charles and Diana were instead each actively shaping their own narratives through cooperating biographers and sympathetic journalists. Inside the private secretary's office, fellows watched this dynamic with a particular kind of professional frustration. Fellows, related to both sides by blood or marriage or institutional duty, found himself trusted by neither camp completely. He continued attending family gatherings at Sandringham and Balmoral, where Diana was sometimes present, navigating the strange reality of sitting across a dinner table from a woman who, in professional settings, he was increasingly required to treat as an adversary of the institution he served. This uncertainty fed into a broader debate taking place quietly among senior courtiers throughout 1994 and into 1995. What, precisely, was Diana's long-term role supposed to be? Some advisors argued for finding her a clearer, semi-official role that would keep her engaged with the institution. Others believed that any accommodation would only encourage further unpredictability, and that the safest course was to let the separation run its course toward full legal divorce. Fellows, by most accounts, occupied a middle position in these discussions. Neither approach, in the end, would matter as much as the choice Diana was quietly making on her own, without consulting the palace at all. By 1995, the tension inside the royal household had calcified into something close to permanent standoff. Diana, operating largely outside the palace's formal structures, had built her own small, independent staff and had begun cultivating relationships with journalists she believed would treat her more fairly than the institution's usual channels allowed. She had grown increasingly convinced that she could not fully trust the people around her, including, in the eyes of some who spoke with her during this period, her own brother-in-law inside Buckingham Palace. Whether or not Fellows had ever personally worked against her interests, and those who worked with him consistently maintained that he had not, the structural reality of his position made him an easy figure for Diana and her allies to view with suspicion. It did not help that Fellows's own wife, Jane, occupied an equally uncomfortable position, caught between loyalty to her younger sister and the marriage she shared with a man whose professional obligations sometimes ran directly counter to Diana's interests. What nobody inside the palace fully understood as 1995 progressed was that Diana had already begun a project that would blow apart whatever fragile equilibrium still existed between her and the institution Fellows served. She had been approached by a BBC journalist named Martin Bashir, and over months of private meetings that Fellows and the rest of the palace knew nothing about, she was being persuaded to sit for an interview unlike anything a senior royal figure had ever given. The entire arrangement was conducted with a level of secrecy Diana herself insisted upon, aware that if word reached the palace before filming was complete, the institution would move quickly to stop it. When that interview finally aired in November 1995, watched by nearly 23 million people in Britain alone, it would place Robert Fellows, quietly and without warning, directly inside one of the most consequential and controversial episodes of his entire career. On the evening of November 20th, 1995, Robert Fellows learned, along with millions of ordinary Britons, that Diana had spoken to a BBC journalist named Martin Bashir for a panorama special that was about to air with almost no warning to the palace. The timing carried a particular irony that would not become clear until years later. Diana had chosen the date deliberately, and it happened to fall on the Queen and Prince Philip's 48th wedding anniversary, a coincidence that struck many royal observers as a pointed statement in itself, whether or not Diana had intended it that way. The interview, filmed in secret at Kensington Palace weeks earlier, was structured as an intimate, unguarded conversation, and it delivered exactly that. Diana spoke openly about her bulimia, her self-harm, and the crushing isolation she had felt as a young bride thrust into an institution that seemed to have no interest in her well-being. She acknowledged her own affair with a former army officer named James Hewitt. She described her marriage using a phrase that instantly entered the national vocabulary, telling Bashir that with Camilla Parker Bowles also in the picture, there had effectively been 3 people in the marriage, leaving it uncomfortably full. Most consequentially, she questioned aloud whether Charles was even suited to become king, suggesting the crown might instead skip directly to William, a statement that struck at the very foundation of the institution Fellows had spent his career protecting. For Fellows personally, the broadcast landed as both an institutional catastrophe and a private betrayal. He had received no warning that Diana was even considering such an interview, let alone that she had spent months secretly meeting with Bashir to arrange it. As the Queen's chief advisor, he was expected to anticipate exactly this kind of threat to the monarchy's stability, and instead, he had watched it unfold live on television alongside the rest of the country, powerless to prepare any institutional response in advance. Colleagues who worked with him in the days immediately following the broadcast described him as angrier than they had ever seen him, a controlled, simmering fury that broke through his usual composure. Some who were close to the situation at the time later suggested he seriously considered whether he could continue in his position at all, given how completely the interview had blindsided the office he ran, though he ultimately remained in the role and turned his energy toward managing what came next, rather than stepping away from it. What made the betrayal sting even more sharply, though nobody inside the palace would learn the full truth for another quarter century, was the method Bashir had used to gain Diana's trust in the first place. In September 1995, Bashir had shown Diana's brother Earl Spencer forged bank statements suggesting that people close to the royal family, including private secretaries working for both Charles and Diana, had been secretly receiving payments from a newspaper group in exchange for information about her. The documents were entirely fabricated, created by a freelance graphic designer who had no idea what purpose they would ultimately serve, but they worked exactly as Bashir intended. Convinced by his brother's account that the people around her, quite possibly including Fellows himself, could not be trusted, Diana agreed to speak to Bashir directly, rather than through the usual channels of royal communication. Fellows would spend years unaware that his own reputation had been quietly weaponized, without his knowledge, as part of the very scheme that produced the interview devastating his institution. The broadcast reached an audience of nearly 23 million people in Britain, an extraordinary figure for a single television special, and its effects rippled outward immediately. Newspapers that had spent years split between the Charles camp and the Diana camp now largely converged on a single conclusion: the marriage was unsalvageable, and the ambiguity surrounding the couple's future status could not continue. Members of Parliament raised questions about the constitutional implications of Diana's remarks concerning Charles's fitness to reign. Commentators debated whether the monarchy itself could survive the kind of scrutiny Diana had just invited into the nation's living rooms. Inside Buckingham Palace, Fellows found himself at the center of an urgent, fast-moving effort to determine how the institution should respond. The Queen, by most accounts, watched the interview with a controlled but visible dismay, understanding immediately that the ambiguous, unresolved separation that had persisted since 1992 could no longer be sustained. Within weeks, the decision had crystallized. On December 18, 1995, the Queen wrote separate letters to both Charles and Diana, informing them that she and Prince Philip believed an early divorce was now desirable. Buckingham Palace confirmed the letters publicly 2 days later, noting that Charles had already indicated his agreement, while Diana had yet to respond. Fellows played a central role in drafting the language surrounding this announcement, work that required him to translate the Queen's private judgment into a public statement, precise enough to signal finality without appearing to punish Diana for the interview that had triggered it. The wording had to satisfy several audiences simultaneously: a public that had grown deeply sympathetic to Diana, a government watching for any sign of constitutional instability, and Charles himself, who needed reassurance that his mother's intervention represented decisive support rather than an implicit rebuke of his own conduct throughout the marriage's collapse. Achieving all of this in a few carefully worded sentences represented exactly the kind of task Fellows had spent nearly 2 decades training for, even as the personal stakes, involving his own sister-in-law, made the exercise more fraught than anything comparable he had handled before. Diana did not respond immediately. According to those close to her at the time, she felt considerable ambivalence about ending a status that, whatever its frustrations, still connected her formally to the institution and to her son's future. It took nearly 2 months of private negotiation before she agreed, in February 1996, to accept the divorce the Queen had recommended. Her legal team, led by solicitor Anthony Julius, worked through the spring and summer of 1996 to settle the practical terms of the separation. A financial settlement reported at the time to be worth around £17 million, continued use of an apartment at Kensington Palace, and a shared arrangement for raising William and Harry that would keep both parents actively involved in their son's upbringing, despite the formal end of the marriage. One of the most contentious points in these negotiations concerned Diana's title. Under the terms eventually agreed, she would retain the style Diana, Princess of Wales, but would no longer be entitled to be addressed as Her Royal Highness, a demotion that many observers, including members of Diana's own circle, viewed as a deliberate and unnecessary humiliation, layered onto an already painful process. Fellows found himself managing the fallout from this specific decision as well, fielding criticism from those who believed the palace was using a minor technicality to punish Diana, even as it publicly maintained that the divorce settlement had been handled with dignity and care for all parties involved. Diana herself was reportedly devastated by the loss of the HRH style, viewing it as confirmation that the institution intended to diminish her status even after granting the divorce it had itself recommended. The divorce was formally finalized on August 28, 1996, closing a chapter that had begun with a wedding watched by hundreds of millions of people 15 years earlier, and had ended with 2 competing television interviews, a secretly recorded phone call, a forged set of documents, and a formal legal separation negotiated across dozens of private meetings between lawyers who had spent months arguing over money, titles, and the custody arrangements for 2 young princes. For Fellows, the divorce represented both an ending and a strange kind of institutional relief. The years of ambiguity that had defined his working life since 1992, the constant uncertainty over Diana's formal status, and the endless negotiation between competing camps, had finally resolved into something legally settled and clear. But the resolution was only legal, not personal. Diana remained his sister-in-law, William and Harry remained his nephews by marriage, and the family gatherings that had grown increasingly strained since 1992 would continue for as long as those bonds held, regardless of what any court document said about her formal royal status. Fellows had spent 6 years managing a crisis that had never fully separated his professional obligations from his private family life, and the divorce, however cleanly it settled matters on paper, did nothing to resolve that deeper entanglement. What none of them could have known, as the ink dried on the settlement in the late summer of 1996, was that they had barely a year left before an entirely different kind of crisis would test Fellows more severely than anything that had come before it. One that would end not in a negotiated settlement, but in a phone call from Paris in the middle of the night. Once the divorce became final in August 1996, Robert Fellows found himself managing something he had not experienced since taking the role of private secretary 6 years earlier: relative quiet on the Diana front. She was no longer the Princess of Wales in the formal royal sense that had once required constant institutional coordination between her household and the palace. She retained her title informally, kept her apartment at Kensington Palace, and remained deeply connected to William and Harry, but the legal machinery that had bound her official life to Buckingham Palace's daily operations had, for the first time in 15 years, been switched off. This quieter period allowed Fellows to turn his attention back toward the broader institutional reforms he had been quietly pushing since the aftermath of the Windsor fire. He continued working within the informal group of advisors, later known publicly as the Way Ahead Group, that met periodically with senior family members to discuss modernizing the monarchy's finances, its relationship with the press, and its public role heading into the new millennium. May 1997 brought a general election that swept Tony Blair's Labour Party into government after 18 years of Conservative rule, a political shift that required Fellows to build an entirely new set of working relationships with a Downing Street operation whose instincts about public image and media management were sharper and more aggressive than anything the palace had previously encountered. Colleagues from this period noted that Fellows approached the transition with his usual pragmatism, recognizing early that Blair's team would expect a more responsive, media-conscious palace than his predecessors had needed to manage. Diana did not use her newfound independence to retreat from public life, as some inside the palace had quietly hoped she might. She used it to expand her humanitarian work into territory that put her on a collision course with the British government, rather than with the institution of the monarchy itself. In December 1996, the charity United Cerebral Palsy honored her as Humanitarian of the Year in New York, a recognition that reflected how thoroughly her public identity had shifted from troubled royal wife to genuine international campaigner. In January 1997, Diana traveled to Angola as a guest of the International Red Cross, supporting the landmine clearance charity known as the Halo Trust. On January 15th, dressed in a protective visor and body armor, she walked through an active minefield in the town of Huambo, an image that became one of the most enduring pictures of her entire public life. She met amputees who had lost limbs to weapons buried in the ground years after the conflicts that planted them had ended. The moment carried genuine risk. The mine clearance expert overseeing her safety later admitted he had spent the walk consumed by the fear that he might become known as the man responsible for detonating a device beneath the most photographed woman in the world. The Angola trip ignited immediate controversy back in London. This was not tabloid gossip about her marriage or her private life. It was a direct political disagreement between Diana and the sitting government over defense policy. Her public support for a total landmine ban ran counter to the official position of John Major's Conservative government, and several ministers criticized her for straying into political territory. One minister reportedly dismissed her as a loose cannon. The criticism proved short-lived and badly miscalculated. Within months, an international movement to ban landmines gained momentum that culminated later that year in the Ottawa Treaty. For Fellows, this new category of controversy sat outside his usual jurisdiction. Diana was no longer formally part of the royal household, which meant her political statements were not, technically, the palace's direct responsibility. Yet many people continued to assume she still spoke for the royal family in some capacity, meant that Fellows and his colleagues still fielded questions about her activities. Colleagues from this period noted a subtle shift in his approach, less anxious crisis management than a kind of resigned monitoring, watching from a greater distance as Diana built a public identity that had genuinely outgrown anything the palace could claim credit for or control. Through the spring, Diana continued the humanitarian campaign, traveling to Washington to meet with Hillary Clinton and building relationships with organizations that would eventually help push landmines onto the global diplomatic agenda. In June, she delivered a keynote address in London, describing landmines as a stealthy killer that claimed victims quietly, long after the wars that buried them had ended. That same month, Diana auctioned off 79 of her most famous gowns at Christie's in New York, raising several $1 million for AIDS and cancer charities. William had reportedly encouraged the idea. The auction functioned as something close to a public statement about her own transformation, a woman deliberately shedding the glamorous, tightly controlled image that had defined her royal years. July brought a shift in her personal life. Diana and her sons vacationed with the Egyptian businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed in the south of France. It was during this trip that she became reacquainted with his son, Dodi Fayed, a film producer she had first met more than a decade earlier. A relationship developed quickly between them, one that tabloids seized on once photographs began circulating. Diana turned 36 on July 1st, marking what would become her final birthday with a gala at London's Tate Gallery. Later in July, Diana traveled to Milan to attend the funeral of her close friend, the fashion designer Gianni Versace, who had been murdered outside his home. She stood alongside other friends of Versace, including the model Naomi Campbell, in a moment of shared grief. In early August, Diana traveled to Bosnia with the Landmine Survivors Network. Days later, she rejoined Dodi Fayed for a Mediterranean cruise aboard his father's yacht, a trip that produced photographs dominating tabloid coverage for the rest of the month. British newspapers speculated openly about whether the relationship might become serious. While Diana's summer played out in the south of France, Fellows and his colleagues inside Buckingham Palace were occupied with an entirely different kind of preparation. The Queen and Prince Philip were approaching their golden wedding anniversary that November, and the household had spent much of the summer planning celebrations intended to remind the public of the stability the monarchy still represented after a decade defined by scandal. Nobody planning those November celebrations had any idea how radically different the mood of that autumn would become. For Fellows personally, the summer of 1997 also brought a quieter, more private kind of relief. Family gatherings no longer carried the same charged undertone that had defined so much of the previous 5 years. Jane, his wife, had spent years absorbing the strain of watching her younger sister's public suffering, and by the summer of 1997, some of that tension had begun, slowly, to ease. In the final days of August, William and Harry remained in Scotland with their father and grandmother, part of the traditional summer stay at Balmoral. Diana had spoken to both boys by telephone in the days before her final trip, an unremarkable moment in a summer that had, for all its tabloid drama, offered her something close to genuine happiness. On August 30th, Diana and Dodi Fayed flew from Sardinia to Paris, planning to spend a single night at the Ritz Hotel before returning to London the following day. What should have been an unremarkable stopover became, within hours, the setting for the final chapter of Robert Fellowes's most consequential professional relationship, a chapter that would begin with a telephone call reaching Balmoral Castle in the earliest hours of the following morning. At 1 o'clock in the morning on August 31st, 1997, the telephone rang in the rooms of Robin Janvrin, the Queen's assistant private secretary, who was staying on the Balmoral estate that week. On the line was the British ambassador to France, Sir Michael J., calling from Paris with news that a car carrying Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Fayed had crashed in a tunnel beneath the Place de l'Alma on the north bank of the Seine, while attempting to outrun a group of pursuing photographers on motorcycles. Llanvrin began the process of waking the people inside Balmoral Castle, who needed to know before anyone else in the world did. Robert Fellows was among the first people informed. He and Llanvrin worked in tandem through those early hours, relaying updates as they arrived from Paris, in fragments that shifted, agonizingly, from cautious hope to devastating certainty. The first reports suggested Dodi Fayed had died at the scene, but that Diana had survived. Inside Balmoral, the Queen was woken and met her son Charles in a corridor of the castle, still in her dressing gown. Staff prepared a pot of tea that nobody in the room found themselves able to drink. The hope generated by those early, mistaken reports did not survive the hour. A second call reached Charles directly from the ambassador, informing him that Diana had died from her injuries a short time after arriving at the hospital. Those present in the castle that morning would later describe watching Charles's composure break entirely for a moment before he gathered himself to begin the impossible task of deciding how and when to tell his sons. For Fellows, the news carried a weight that few other people inside that castle could fully share. He was not simply managing an institutional crisis of the sort he had spent 7 years preparing for. He had just lost his own sister-in-law, a woman he had watched grow from a shy teenage bridesmaid at his own wedding into the most famous woman on earth. There was no precedent inside the modern monarchy for a private secretary managing the death of a former royal wife, who also happened to be his own family. Charles took on the task of waking William and Harry, then 15 and 12, to tell them their mother had died. He chose to do this himself. The boys had spoken to Diana by telephone just the previous evening, and neither of them had any warning that the call would turn out to be their last with her. Within hours, the practical machinery of managing a death that would soon dominate headlines around the world began grinding into motion. One of the earliest and most consequential decisions involved Diana's body, still in Paris. On the Queen's explicit instructions, Fellows arranged for it to be brought back discreetly to a mortuary on the Fulham Road in London, the facility used by the royal coroner. Charles, furious both on his own behalf and on behalf of his sons, confronted Fellows directly over the arrangement, and the two men found themselves in a bitter argument that ended, according to accounts later published by royal historians, with Charles shouting at his former brother-in-law to go and impale himself on his own flagstaff. Within Britain, an outpouring of collective grief began almost immediately. Flowers began appearing outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace within hours, growing into something resembling a sea across the Mall. Mourners queued for hours to sign condolence books, and shops across the country reported selling out of flowers, candles, and framed photographs of Diana within 48 hours. The royal family, following its long-standing habit of remaining at Balmoral through the end of the summer, stayed in Scotland during the first days after Diana's death, prioritizing the private task of comforting William and Harry. This decision became a significant public relations problem almost as soon as it became widely known. Newspapers began asking, with mounting impatience, why the Queen had not returned to London and why no flag flew at half-mast above Buckingham Palace.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
The new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, understood the scale of what was unfolding. Speaking to his press secretary from his constituency in County Durham, he reportedly predicted that Diana's death would unleash grief on a scale the world had never witnessed. Blair's own public tribute described Diana as the people's princess, language that captured and arguably helped accelerate a public mood the palace itself was still struggling to fully comprehend. Downing Street's evident comfort with the emotional register of the moment created a subtle tension for Fellows, whose entire professional training pushed him toward measured institutional language rather than immediate, emotionally direct statements. As the week progressed, Fellows became deeply involved in one of the most delicate negotiations of the entire crisis, determining what kind of funeral would take place. The Spencer family, led by Diana's brother Charles, the 9th Earl Spencer, initially favoured a smaller, more private affair. The palace, and increasingly Downing Street as well, understood that a private funeral would fail to accommodate a nation whose grief had already spilled into the streets. Fellows occupied a uniquely useful position in resolving this tension. As Jane's husband, he was Diana's brother-in-law as much as he was the Queen's chief advisor, and he used that dual standing to help persuade the Spencer family that a larger, public ceremony had become necessary. He spent hours on the telephone, moving between Balmoral, London, and the Spencer family's own gatherings. Those involved in the negotiations later credited Fellows specifically with helping bridge a gap between the Spencers and the palace that might otherwise have produced a funeral arrangement satisfying neither side. That broader criticism reached its peak around September 3rd and 4th. Under mounting pressure, advisors including Fellows worked to persuade the Queen that a public address, along with a return to London, had become unavoidable. The Queen delivered a live television broadcast on September 5th, acknowledging Diana as an exceptional and gifted human being who had, in good times and bad, never lost her ability to smile and laugh. The funeral took place on September 6, 1997, at Westminster Abbey, watched by hundreds of millions worldwide. More than 1 million people lined the funeral route through central London, standing in near total silence. Earl Spencer's eulogy, delivered with a barely restrained anger toward the press and an implicit criticism of the royal family's treatment of his sister, drew applause from the crowds outside that audibly filtered into the building itself, an unprecedented breach of the solemnity such occasions traditionally commanded. In the years that followed, conspiracy theories surrounding Diana's death would occasionally implicate Fellows directly, driven by allegations from Mohammed al-Fayed. When examined during the British inquest, held more than a decade later, former Ambassador Michael J. testified under oath that Fellows had not been in Paris that night at all. The inquest confirmed what most credible investigations had already concluded: a mundane and preventable tragedy involving speed, a drinking driver, and pursuing paparazzi, rather than any orchestrated conspiracy. For Robert Fellows personally, the 10 days between Diana's death and her funeral represented the most demanding stretch of his entire career. He had spent 7 years managing the slow collapse of his sister-in-law's marriage. He now had to manage her death and burial using the very same skills, even as he buried a member of his own family in front of the largest television audience the world had ever assembled. By the time 1998 arrived, Robert Fellows had spent 8 years as private secretary to the sovereign, longer than all but a handful of men who had ever held the position. Colleagues who worked alongside him during that final year in office described someone who carried himself with a quieter, more settled bearing than he had during the crisis years of 1992 through 1995. A man who had absorbed the worst that the job could throw at him and survived it, even if the personal cost had been considerable. On June 1, 1998, Buckingham Palace announced that Robin Janvrin, who had served as Fellows' own deputy since 1996, would succeed him as private secretary to the sovereign. He formally left the post on February 4, 1999, closing a chapter that had begun in 1977, when he first joined the royal household as a 35-year-old former banker. The 9 years he had spent as private secretary encompassed a period of crisis that no comparable stretch in the modern monarchy's history had matched. He had managed the collapse of 3 royal marriages within a single calendar year. He had helped guide the Queen through the most painful public speech of her reign. He had negotiated, from inside his own extended family, a royal divorce settlement, and he had managed the death and burial of a woman who had been his sister-in-law since she stood as a teenage bridesmaid at his own wedding 2 decades earlier. Fellows' departure from royal service did not mean a departure from public life altogether. He returned to the world of finance, joining Barclays Private Banking first as vice chairman and eventually rising to chairman of the division, drawing directly on the banking instincts he had developed decades earlier at Allen Harvey and Ross. Colleagues from the private banking world noted that he approached client relationships with the same careful discretion that had defined his approach to royal service. In the Queen's birthday honours list that summer, announced July 12, 1999, Fellows was created a life peer, taking the title Baron Fellows of Shottisham in the county of Norfolk. He formally took his seat in the House of Lords on October 26, 1999, sitting as a crossbench peer. He would remain a member of the Lords for more than 2 decades. What distinguished Fellows' post-retirement life was the degree to which his connection to the Queen personally continued in ways both formal and deeply personal. He was appointed Secretary and Registrar of the Order of Merit in 2003, overseeing one of the most exclusive orders in British public life, limited to just 24 living members. He held that position for nearly 2 decades. Even more significantly, Fellows remained an extra equerry to the Queen for the rest of her life. Those close to the royal household described him as someone the Queen genuinely trusted to call upon for advice or presence at moments of institutional significance, a bond that predated his formal appointment as private secretary by nearly 5 decades, and had begun, absurdly, with her holding him as an infant on the grounds of Sandringham in December 1941. A quarter-century after the Panorama interview that had blindsided him so completely in 1995, Fellows lived to see at least partial vindication. In May 2021, an independent inquiry, led by the retired judge Lord Dyson, concluded that Martin Bashir had used deceitful methods, including the fabricated bank statements shown to Earl Spencer, to secure Diana's cooperation. The BBC issued formal apologies to Prince William, Prince Harry, and Earl Spencer, and returned every award the interview had ever received. For Fellows, the findings offered a quiet, belated confirmation that the wound inflicted on the palace in November 1995 had been the product of genuine deception rather than simply Diana's own choice to speak freely. In 2002, both the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret died within months of each other, a double loss that struck during what was supposed to be the Queen's Golden Jubilee year. Fellows attended both funerals as a family member and former senior courtier. The Jubilee celebrations that summer generated a wave of goodwill toward the monarchy that would have seemed unimaginable a decade earlier, and Fellows' quiet, persistent advocacy for institutional reform throughout the 1990s was one of several forces historians credited with helping the institution survive its most difficult decade. The 2010s brought renewed public attention through an unexpected medium, television drama. Netflix's series The Crown introduced a dramatized version of Fellows, played by Andrew Havel, appearing across the show's 5th and 6th seasons. For a man who had spent his career deliberately avoiding public visibility, this posthumous relevance represented an odd kind of fame, achieved not through anything he chose to say, but through dramatized reconstruction. Fellows' own reflections on his career tended toward understatement, once describing the path that brought men of his background into royal service as quite a gilded cage. The final major transition of Fellows' long connection to the institution came in September 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral after 70 years on the throne. He had already stepped down from the House of Lords that February, 7 months before her death. Robert Fellows died on July 29, 2024, at the age of 82, in Norfolk, the county where he had been born on royal land more than 8 decades earlier. His will left the bulk of his estate, valued at approximately £1.5 million, to his wife, Jane. Neither William nor Harry were named in the document. What remains, in the end, of Robert Fellows' place in this history is neither the villain some of Diana's most devoted supporters once imagined, nor the flawless institutional guardian the palace's own messaging occasionally suggested, but something closer to what he actually was. A man born into an inherited proximity to power he had not chosen, who spent 9 of the most difficult years in the modern monarchy's history trying to hold together an institution and a family pulling apart from multiple directions at once. He was Diana's brother-in-law before he was ever her institutional adversary, and those two roles never fully separated across the entire span of his career. He did not choose the crisis that defined his working life, and he could not prevent its most devastating outcome. But those who worked alongside him consistently described a man who approached an impossible situation with more decency than the public narrative of the 1990s often allowed him credit for. Robert Fellows spent his career standing at the exact point where the Crown and one of its most beloved and troubled members collided, and he carried that position, imperfectly but with real integrity, until the end of a life that began on royal land in the middle of a world war, and closed, 82 years later, not far from where it had started. Every account of Robert Fellows' career inevitably returns to his professional role, the decisions he made as private secretary, the crises he managed on behalf of an institution he served for over 2 decades. Far less attention has ever been paid to the person who arguably carried the heaviest private burden of the entire saga, his wife, Jane. She was Diana's older sister, married to the very man whose job required him to manage the institution's response to Diana's unraveling marriage. Cynthia Jane Spencer was born on February 11, 1957, at Park House in King's Lynn, Norfolk, the second daughter of Edward John Spencer, later the 8th Earl Spencer. She was educated, like her younger sisters, at Westheath Girls' School in Kent, the same school Diana herself attended a few years behind her. Andrew Morton, in his later biography of Diana, described Jane's own educational record with gentle irony, noting she had acquired little more than a scattered handful of O-level and A-level qualifications. Growing up at Park House, on the grounds of the Sandringham estate itself, Jane spent her earliest years in close physical proximity to the very royal family her husband would one day serve, an odd symmetry connecting the Fellows and Spencer childhoods long before either family had reason to suspect how thoroughly their futures would intertwine. Jane met Robert Fellows through family connections that ran deeper than most outsiders realized, distant relations whose families' histories had crossed paths repeatedly over the centuries. When they married on April 20, 1978, at the Guards Chapel, Jane was 21 and Robert was 36. Nobody at that wedding could have anticipated how completely their lives would become entangled with the fate of the youngest Spencer sister, then a shy 17-year-old standing among the bridesmaids. Their first child, Laura Jane, was born July 19, 1980, a year before Diana's own engagement transformed the family's public profile overnight. A son, Alexander Robert, followed in 1983, and a daughter, Eleanor Ruth, in 1985. By the time Eleanor was born, Diana had already spent 4 years as Princess of Wales and had begun experiencing the private unhappiness that would not become public knowledge for several more years. Jane, raising 3 young children of her own, occupied a strange dual vantage point, close enough to sense the growing strain in her sister's marriage, yet fully occupied with the ordinary demands of her own domestic life. When Diana married Charles in 1981, both sisters lived in close proximity at Kensington Palace. Diana reportedly relied on Jane as one of the few family members who understood both worlds simultaneously, ordinary Spencer family life and the increasingly alien demands of formal royal existence. As the 1990s progressed, Jane's position grew markedly more difficult. Diana's former butler, Paul Burrell, later claimed the sisters had grown estranged, specifically because of Robert's institutional position, and that by 1997 they had not spoken in years. Burrell's own credibility became a subject of controversy following a 2002 theft trial that collapsed after the Queen recalled a conversation undermining the prosecution's case, leaving some historians cautious about his recollections. Mary Clark, Diana's childhood nanny, insisted the relationship was never as bitter as Burrell suggested. The disagreement has never been resolved in the public record, partly because Jane herself, much like her husband, almost never spoke publicly about her own experience of the decade. Whatever the precise state of their relationship by 1997, the events of that August made clear the bond remained significant. Jane and her sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, flew to Paris with Prince Charles to identify Diana's body. Witnesses described Jane as so devastated she needed to be physically assisted into a chair, unable to stand under the weight of what she was confronting. It was the raw grief of an older sister, regardless of whatever distance the previous years had placed between them. For Robert Fellows, managing the institutional response from Balmoral and London, while his own wife absorbed one of the most devastating losses imaginable, unable to be fully present for her, added another layer to an already unbearable week. Those close to the couple described a marriage tested severely by impossible dual demands, each of them navigating the same catastrophe from a different, equally exhausting angle. Jane and Sarah both played visible roles in the funeral itself, standing among the immediate family, present as a sister burying a sister rather than an institutional representative. In the years following Diana's death, Robert and Jane retreated into a remarkably private life. Their 3 children grew into adulthood, largely outside the intense scrutiny that had defined their aunt's life. having absorbed the central lesson of their parents' experience without needing it explained, that a quieter life offered protections their aunt had never been permitted. Laura married Nicholas Petman in 2009 in a wedding attended by William and Catherine, and later became godmother to Princess Charlotte. Alexander married Alexandra Finlay in 2013, and their children, born in 2015 and 2016, grew up knowing their grandfather only as a quiet, private figure. Eleanor followed a path even more private than her siblings. Jane continued appearing at royal occasions, watching William marry in 2011 in the same abbey where she had buried his mother 14 years earlier. In 2018, she delivered a reading at Harry's wedding to Meghan Markle, a gesture placing her deliberately at the center of the celebration rather than the periphery. A small sign that whatever damage the 1990s had done, some of it had found its way toward healing. Robert Fellowes died in July 2024, leaving Jane to navigate widowhood after 46 years of a marriage that had weathered pressures almost no other couple in modern British history faced simultaneously. His will left the bulk of his estate to her. Neither William nor Harry were named. What the story of Jane and Robert Fellowes ultimately illustrates is the largely invisible cost that fell on family members caught between royal duty and personal love. Robert's professional obligations have been extensively documented and dramatized. Jane's experience remains almost entirely undocumented in her own words, pieced together only through conflicting staff accounts and the visible evidence of her collapse beside her sister's body in a Paris hospital. She never gave an interview correcting the record, never published a memoir, never publicly weighed in on her husband's disputed legacy. In a family built on centuries of practiced silence, Jane Fellowes may have been the most silent and unexamined figure of them all. To understand what made Robert Fellowes' position so uniquely difficult, it helps to step back and look at the office he inherited, an institution with its own long history of courtiers managing royal crises long before Diana ever entered the picture. The role of private secretary to the sovereign dates back to 1805, but its modern character took shape across the 20th century through a small handful of men whose handling of earlier scandals established the very playbook Fellowes would later inherit, adapt, and in some respects, be forced to abandon. The most consequential of these predecessors was Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, private secretary to George VI and then briefly Elizabeth II. Lascelles established his reputation during the abdication crisis of 1936, working alongside then Private Secretary Alexander Hardinge, who wrote Edward the Phages a blunt letter warning of the constitutional dangers his relationship with Wallis Simpson posed. Edward I never forgave Lascelles, calling him privately that snake, and Lascelles made little effort to hide his own contempt, telling friends he considered the former king a man given every gift except a soul. Lascelles's most direct parallel to Fellowes came when Princess Margaret fell in love with the divorced group captain Peter Townsend. When Townsend informed Lascelles of his intention to marry the princess, Lascelles's reported response, that Townsend must be mad, or bad, or both, became one of the most quoted lines in modern royal history. Lascelles arranged for Townsend's posting to Brussels, a quiet, procedural solution to separate the couple. It worked. Margaret abandoned her plans in October 1955. What makes this affair such an illuminating precursor is the difference in outcome. In 1955, British newspaper editors still observed unwritten limits on privacy, relationships built on decades of mutual accommodation between palace and press. By the 1990s, satellite trucks could broadcast live within minutes, and a global tabloid market paid enormous sums for exactly the privacy violations that had simply been unprofitable in Lascelles's era. Between Lascelles and Fellowes stood other private secretaries, Sir Michael A. Deane, 1953 to 1972, who adapted the office to Britain's eroding post-war deference, Sir Martin Charteris, 1972 to 1977, who navigated 1970s political instability and applied the Lascelles principles on dissolving Parliament, a doctrine Lascelles himself had published anonymously under a pseudonym in 1950, and Sir Philip Moore, 1977 to 1986, under whom Fellowes joined as a junior officer and learned to navigate the tense Thatcher Palace relationship. Fellowes's most direct mentor, Sir William Heseltine, brought a different pedigree entirely. Raised in a small Western Australian farming town, the son of a bank manager, a former journalist. Heseltine's outsider perspective gave him a more pragmatic approach to institutional change than his English gentry predecessors, and Fellows absorbed this directly as his deputy through the 1980s, watching Heseltine begin professionalizing the palace's press relationships years before the crisis of the 1990s made such professionalization existential. None of these predecessors, however, faced a crisis playing out across a genuinely global media environment. The Townsend affair unfolded within British domestic press boundaries. Diana's story unfolded on magazine covers in dozens of countries simultaneously. Fellows was, in effect, trying to run Lascelles's playbook in a world that had made it obsolete, discovering that there was no embassy posting that could neutralize a tell-all book already printed, no discreet conversation that could undo a secretly recorded phone call already transcribed by tabloid editors. Historians studying this transition note a specific irony. The institutional continuity that had once been the office's greatest strength became, in the early 1990s, closer to a liability. Fellows had been trained by men shaped by an era when quiet maneuvering reliably worked, and unlearning that instinct in real time, while managing a crisis with his own family at its center, required a flexibility nothing in his apprenticeship had prepared him for. That he eventually did adapt, pushing the palace toward financial transparency and public accessibility rather than continued denial, represents perhaps his most significant and least publicly recognized achievement. That legacy outlasted his own tenure. Robin Janvrin, who succeeded him in 1999, inherited an office already forced through the painful adaptation Fellows had lived through, and could build directly on the transparency reforms, rather than discovering their necessity through his own catastrophic learning curve. In this sense, Fellows's most enduring legacy may not be any single decision made during the crisis years, but the institutional inheritance he left behind, an office better prepared for modern public life than the one he had walked into in 1977, precisely because he had been forced to learn, through 9 years of genuinely painful trial and error, lessons that Lascelles, Adiane, and Charteris never needed to learn at all. While Robert Fellows worked to manage the institutional crisis from inside Buckingham Palace, an entirely separate and increasingly vicious battle was unfolding around him, fought not through formal palace channels, but through a shifting alliance of private secretaries, hired media consultants, and sympathetic journalists working on behalf of Charles and Diana individually. Royal correspondents gave this conflict a name that stuck: the War of the Waleses. Two rival operations actively competing for public sympathy through the press. At the center of Diana's side stood Patrick Jephson, an Irish-born former Royal Navy officer who became her private secretary in 1988, holding the position for 8 years. Jephson, with a Cambridge Master's in Political Science, organized nearly all of Diana's foreign travel and functioned as the chief architect of her independent public identity. He witnessed, from an even closer vantage point than Fellows in many respects, the day-to-day mechanics of how Diana's marriage broke down. Jephson's position mirrored Fellows's own in certain respects, a trusted secretary managing an impossibly difficult principal, but where Fellows answered ultimately to the Queen and the broader institution, Jephson answered directly and exclusively to Diana, uncomplicated by the institutional double duty that defined Fellows's tenure. Jephson's tenure ended abruptly in January 1996, in circumstances not understood until decades later. Martin Bashir's forged bank documents, used to secure the Panorama interview, had specifically suggested Jephson was being paid by unnamed dark forces to spy on Diana. This fabrication struck at the exact foundation of trust that had allowed him to function as her closest confidant. Jephson resigned on January 22, 1996, weeks after the Queen's divorce letters. His assistant resigned the following day. The full truth didn't emerge until the 2021 Dyson inquiry confirmed the documents were entirely fabricated. The BBC later paid Jephson damages directly. Jephson later reflected that those closest to Diana came to believe she might not have died in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel if she had never given the interview at all. If Jephson represented Diana's side during Fellows's own tenure, the war's most sophisticated chapter unfolded only after both men had left their posts. Mark Bolland, previously of the Advertising Standards Authority and Press Complaints Commission, joined Charles's household as Deputy Private Secretary in 1997, months after Diana's death, and spent 5 years engineering one of the most successful reputation rehabilitation campaigns in modern British public life. Charles's approval had collapsed to roughly 20% after Diana's death. Bolland, working alongside Charles's private secretary Stephen Lamport, built it back to as high as 75% through cultivated journalist relationships and carefully staged images, including Charles and Camilla's first officially photographed appearance together in January 1999, choreographed with a precision entirely unlike Fellowes' reactive crisis management. This aggressive approach was not universally welcomed. Reports suggested the Queen herself was displeased with aspects of Bolland's methods, which reportedly extended to briefing against other family members. Bolland departed in 2002 amid this same friction, having achieved his objective but worn out his welcome among traditional courtiers. The mechanics of this media war extended into the working relationships between specific correspondents and rival camps, certain newspapers cultivating Diana's sympathetic narrative, others building closer ties to Charles's camp, transforming royal reporting into something closer to competitive political journalism. Fellowes, without any equivalent hired strategist working on the institution's behalf, found himself refereeing a conflict between parties with communications tools considerably more sophisticated than anything the palace's traditional press office had been built to counter. Fellowes occupied an unusual transitional position, too early to employ Bolland's aggressive tactics, yet forced by the scale of the crisis to abandon the purely reactive, discretion-first philosophy of his predecessors. Whether a Fellowes equipped with Bolland's instincts might have managed 1992 through 1997 differently remains a tantalizing counterfactual, though the family loyalties complicating his every decision, loyalties a hired outside consultant never had to navigate, likely made such a strategy unavailable to him regardless. The War of the Waleses produced no clean victors. Jeffson lost his position through no fault of his own, later writing 2 memoirs about the experience. Fellowes spent 9 years improvising with inherited tools while his own family bore the cost. Bolland, despite his success, departed under his own cloud of controversy. What the war did produce, permanently, was a fundamental transformation in how the monarchy would manage its public image for every decade that followed, from an institution believing deference could be preserved through silence, to one that grudgingly accepted it needed to shape its own narrative or have it shaped by others. Fellowes lived through the first, most painful half of that lesson. He didn't remain in office to see the second half fully proven, but the path he'd already begun clearing made Bolland's later transformation easier to complete. Robert Fellowes left Buckingham Palace on February 4, 1999, carrying almost nothing publicly visible from 9 years spent at the center of the worst decade in the modern monarchy's history. No memoir, no interview series, no sympathetic biography commissioned with his cooperation. The man who had read every piece of sensitive correspondence addressed to the Queen, drafted the words that framed her worst crises, and managed the institutional fallout from 3 broken marriages and 1 devastating death, walked out of royal service and went back to banking. For most people tracking the story of the 1990s, that exit marked the end of his relevance. The truth was considerably more complicated. What Fellowes did in the 25 years between leaving the private secretary's office and his death in July 2024 tells you something about him that his time inside the palace never quite could. Inside Buckingham Palace, his choices were constrained by the demands of the institution he served. Every public position he took was the Queen's position. Every statement released under his authority was, at minimum, one she had read. Every reform he pushed internally had to be framed as consistent with traditions stretching back centuries, even when the whole point was to break from those traditions. The real measure of what Robert Fellowes believed, as distinct from what his role required him to say, came after he stopped being required to say anything at all. The first indication arrived almost immediately. Weeks after leaving royal service, someone brought him to see inside Brixton Prison. The person who arranged the visit is not recorded in any public account Fellowes left behind, which tells you something about how he generally preferred to describe his own life. What he did describe In the second interview he gave in his entire adult life, a conversation with Mary Riddell of the Daily Telegraph in 2008, was the effect the visit had on him. He called it an epiphany, a word that appears nowhere else in anything he ever said publicly about himself or his career. The sight of young men locked in cramped and dirty cells, in a building that had been processing human failure since 1820, broke through the practiced equanimity that had defined his professional manner for more than 2 decades. He came out of Brixton Prison with a commitment to prison reform that would occupy a significant part of the remaining 25 years of his life. The word epiphany is worth sitting with for a moment. This was a man who had spent 9 years receiving the worst possible news about people he knew personally, sometimes loved, and had to process that news without ever allowing visible distress to compromise his professional usefulness to the Queen. He had been the man in the corridor at Balmoral on the night Diana died, managing information that would have broken most people in half, managing it because that was what the job required. That same man walked into Brixton Prison and found himself undone by something he had had no professional obligation to witness and no institutional reason to care about. It suggests that whatever composure had carried him through the 1990s was a professional discipline rather than a personal one, and that below it, the capacity for genuine shock and genuine moral response was intact. He became chair of the Prison Reform Trust in 2001, succeeding the former Home Secretary Douglas Hurd in the position. The Prison Reform Trust is not a gentle, establishment-friendly lobbying body. It was founded in 1981 by people who were actively dissatisfied with the direction of penal policy in Britain, and it has spent its existence arguing, with varying success and often against considerable political resistance, for a criminal justice system that treats incarceration as a genuine last resort rather than a default response to social failure. Fellows sat in that chair for 7 years, during which the British prison population continued climbing toward record levels, and the political appetite for the kind of sentencing reform the Trust advocated remained limited. He stayed with it anyway. The people who worked alongside him at the Trust later described the same qualities that had characterized his approach to everything else. He was quiet, highly principled, open-minded, and equipped with a dry sense of humor that those who only knew him from newspaper coverage rarely anticipated. The Churchill Fellowship, where he served as a trustee from 2000 and as chairman from 2010 to 2015, described him in almost identical terms after his death. He was humbled, in a genuine rather than performative way, by the fellows he met during his time there, people who had travelled at the organisation's expense to study solutions to Britain's social problems in other countries, then brought what they had learned home to places where it was badly needed. The prison reform strand of the fellowship's work was something fellows pushed actively, and the two organisations, the Prison Reform Trust and the Churchill Fellowship, overlapped in their focus on exactly the people and places that the World Fellows had spent his career serving had no particular reason to think about. This is the contradiction at the centre of his post-palace life that most accounts of the 1990s fail to examine, because they end before it becomes visible. The man whom Diana's supporters spent years characterising as the embodiment of cold institutional self-protection spent the last quarter of his life fighting for the welfare of people at the farthest possible remove from institutional privilege. He was a non-executive director of South African breweries, a trustee of the Rhodes Trust and the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, and a vice-chairman of the Commonwealth Institute, all of which pointed toward a post-imperial internationalism that sat at some distance from the England of Sandringham and Eton in which he had been raised. None of these positions were ceremonial in the way that many such appointments are for retired establishment figures. People who worked alongside him consistently said he showed up, engaged with the substance of the work, and pushed it forward, rather than simply lending his name to it. He returned to the city in the professional role that made sense given his background, vice-chairman and later chairman of Barclays Private Banking, drawing on the instincts he had developed at Allen Harvey and Ross decades before the palace had come calling. The combination, a senior banking position running alongside active work on prison reform and social justice, was unusual enough that it surprised people who encountered it without expecting it. His obituary in the Daily Telegraph noted this apparent incongruity with mild puzzlement before concluding, more or less correctly, that Fellows had simply never been the one-dimensional figure that the decade's dramatic narrative had required him to be. The House of Lords, where he sat as a crossbench peer from October 1999 until his retirement from the chamber in February 2022, gave him a platform for precisely the kind of institutional engagement that had characterized his entire adult life. Crossbench peers are, by design, independent of party whipping. They vote according to their own judgment rather than a party's instruction, which meant that Fellows, for the first time in a career spent serving institutions with very specific demands on his loyalty, could say what he actually thought and vote the way he actually believed, without those choices being attributed to anyone else's agenda. He served on the Lords Constitution Committee, work that drew directly on the specific knowledge of constitutional practice he had accumulated during 9 years managing the relationship between the Crown and successive governments. He sat on the committee that reviewed the future of the Archbishop of Canterbury's office, an intersection of Crown, Church, and parliamentary authority that would have been familiar territory to the man who had spent years coordinating the monarchy's relationships with the Church of England. He did not use these platforms to relitigate the 1990s. This requires some emphasis, because it was not an obvious choice. Patrick Jepson, Diana's private secretary during much of the same decade, eventually wrote 2 books about his experience. Multiple senior courtiers who worked through the same years found ways, through authorized biographies or cooperative documentaries, to shape how their own roles were understood by posterity. Fellows wrote nothing, authorized nothing, and spoke publicly almost never. His silence was, by any reasonable standard, a choice rather than an inability to speak, and it was a choice he maintained, even as the interpretations of the 1990s that gained public currency were sometimes significantly unfair to him. The most personally significant of those unfair interpretations came from inside his own family. When Prince Harry published his memoir in January 2023, the book described the palace machinery of the 1990s in terms that were consistently hostile to the people who had run it. Fellows was not named directly in the most damaging passages, but the institutional portrait Harry drew was one in which the people advising the Queen had been indifferent, or worse, to Diana's suffering. Given that the man who had occupied that role for most of the relevant period was his own uncle by marriage, the man who had attended his parents' wedding as a young courtier, and who had held his mother's family in genuine affection, the absence of any specific exemption from the general charge carried its own weight. Fellows did not respond publicly. He never had. Harry's security dispute with the British government, which made international headlines throughout the early 2020s and showed no sign of resolution before Fellows died, meant that when Fellows passed away on July 29, 2024, at 82 years old at his home in Norfolk, there was genuine uncertainty about whether Harry would be able to attend the funeral. The practical issue was straightforward. Harry had lost his automatic entitlement to taxpayer-funded protection in the United Kingdom after stepping back as a senior royal in 2020, and had been fighting a legal battle to restore it ever since. Traveling to Britain for any occasion required him to notify authorities 28 days in advance, and to make separate security arrangements that he considered inadequate for his family's safety. In the immediate aftermath of Fellowes's death, sources told journalists that Harry would not be attending the funeral service. He came anyway. On August 28, 2024, both William and Harry arrived at St. Mary's Church in Snettisham, Norfolk, a few miles from the Sandringham estate where Fellows had been born 82 years earlier. The church sits in a village surrounded by the same flat Norfolk farmland that had defined the Fellows family's connection to this corner of England for generations, and the service was, by all accounts, a genuine family occasion, rather than the kind of obligation-fulfilling public ceremony that had come to characterize many of the occasions that brought the two brothers into proximity. Harry flew from his home in California to be there. He had, according to sources close to the family, a genuine warmth toward his uncle that went beyond the formal relationship of nephew and uncle by marriage, a closeness that had survived even the years when his relationship with the institution Fellows had served grew increasingly bitter. They did not speak to each other at the service. Witnesses described them keeping their distance throughout, sitting separately, never meeting each other's eye. Fellows, who had spent the most consequential years of his professional life trying to prevent exactly this kind of rupture within the family he served, was buried, while the proof of how completely that rupture had taken hold sat visible to anyone present in the church. It was a conclusion to his story that he had not been able to prevent and had not lived to see fully resolved. William's relationship with his uncle had followed a different trajectory than Harry's, though both were genuine. William had grown up with Fellows occupying a strange dual position. The man who managed the institutional response to his parents' disintegrating marriage was simultaneously the man who sat at his Aunt Jane's kitchen table during holidays. The uncle who had known William's mother since she was a teenager, who had watched William himself arrive in the world at a time when the story around him still looked, from a distance, like it might resolve happily. William attended Eton, as Fellows had 4 decades earlier, and the overlap of school and family gave their relationship a texture beyond what formal connection alone produced. Fellows's will, which had been written in 2012 and was published in the months following his death, left the bulk of his estate, valued at approximately £1.5 million. Neither William nor Harry was named. The will included charitable donations to Tapping House Hospice, the Rhodes Trust, St Mary's Church Snettisham, and the Provost and Fellows of Eton College. That last bequest a small closing gesture toward the institution that had marked him at 18 and had marked his nephews 2 generations later. The omission of William and Harry from the will was not a statement of estrangement. It was the financial decision of a man who had watched his own family bear enormous costs on behalf of 2 young princes across many decades, and who believed, reasonably, that the welfare of the living members of the Fellows household was the appropriate priority. After Harry returned from the memorial service, he travelled to Althorpe House, the ancestral Spencer home in Northamptonshire, where he stayed for several days with his uncle Earl Spencer. The Spencers, watching from outside the Windsor institution throughout the years of Diana's public suffering and its aftermath, had maintained a consistent warmth toward both brothers that survived even the years of maximum fracture. Jane Fellows, who had attended the 10th anniversary of the Invictus Games in London in May 2024, in a public gesture of support for Harry, occupied a position of particular delicacy in this landscape. She was Robert's widow, Diana's sister, William and Harry's aunt, and a woman who had watched the 2 sides of the family she belonged to pull against each other for 30 years without ever publicly choosing between them. The quiet that surrounded Fellows throughout the final chapter of his life was not the silence of someone who had run out of things to say. He had worked with people at the Churchill Fellowship who described him as unfailingly engaged, genuinely interested in the social problems he had chosen to focus on, and capable of a directness in private conversation that his public record never suggested. The Churchill Fellowship's chief executive, reflecting on his time as chairman after his death, noted that he always said, during the interview process and whenever he met Fellows, how humbled he felt by their achievements and their commitment. Humility is not the quality that the public narrative of the 1990s, shaped by sources with competing agendas, ever attributed to the man in the corridor behind the Queen. The people who actually worked with him in the last 2 decades of his life described it as one of his most consistent characteristics. He had spent 9 years being the person through whom difficult information flowed toward the most powerful woman in the country. He had managed that flow with a care for the institution and a discipline about his own responses that the decade had tested repeatedly and sometimes found wanting, but had not broken. What he did with the freedom that came after, the prison reform work, the Churchill Fellowship, the crossbench independence of the Lords, suggested a man who had absorbed something from the worst years of his career beyond simply relief that they were over. He had watched an institution built on precedent and silence struggle to survive in a world that had outgrown both, and he had emerged from that watching with a preference for openness and adaptation that his professional life had rarely been able to express directly. The memorial service at St Mary's Snettisham closed quietly. A church warden told the BBC that it was a lovely family occasion celebrating the life of a very special man. William and Harry left separately. Jane Fellows, at 67, became the last surviving person who had stood at the center of every significant event in this story. The 1978 wedding, where Diana was a bridesmaid, the decade of crisis, the Paris hospital, the funeral cortege through London, and now this smaller, older gathering in Norfolk, in the flat country where it had all begun. The 127-page report that Lord Dyson published on May 20th, 2021, was the product of an investigation commissioned by the BBC following pressure that had been building, quietly, for more than 2 decades. Most of the public attention it received focused on what Bashir had done to secure the interview, and on the BBC's subsequent cover-up of what it knew. Both warranted the attention they received, but buried inside the report's findings were implications that reached beyond Bashir and the BBC into the private lives of several people who had never sought public attention and who had spent years carrying consequences they had no way of understanding until the inquiry forced them into the open. Robert Fellowes was not among those who received a formal apology from the BBC or a financial settlement following the Dyson report. His name did not appear in the list of individuals the corporation had wronged directly enough to require compensation. But the inquiry's findings, read carefully alongside what had actually happened inside Buckingham Palace in the autumn of 1995, made clear that the deception Bashir constructed had landed consequences on Fellowes that he carried for years without knowing their true origin. To understand why, it is necessary to go back to what Bashir actually did and in what order he did it. His first meeting with Earl Spencer took place at Althorpe on August 31st, 1995. At that meeting, he showed Spencer bank statements that had been fabricated by a graphic designer named Matt Weisler, documents purporting to show that Alan Waller, Spencer's own former head of security, had received payments totaling over £10,000 from News International and a consultancy firm. The documents were designed to convince Spencer that people close to Diana were being paid to monitor and report on her, that she was surrounded by individuals whose loyalty to her was a performance rather than a reality. Spencer was disturbed by what he saw, but not yet persuaded to make an introduction. Bashir returned 2 weeks later, on September 14th, and showed him a second set of fabricated documents. This time the statements alleged payments from intelligence service funds into the bank accounts of the private secretaries working for both Diana and Prince Charles. Lord Dyson's report concluded that it was likely these second documents were created by Bashir himself rather than commissioned from Weisler, meaning Bashir had graduated from commissioning forgeries to producing them directly. The individuals named on those documents were Patrick Jepson, Diana's own private secretary, and Richard Aylard, Charles's. Both were men who had served their principals with genuine loyalty. Both had their reputations quietly destroyed in Diana's eyes, without ever being told what had been said about them, or given any opportunity to respond. The Dyson report confirmed that Bashir did not fabricate documents naming Fellowes specifically in these September meetings with Spencer. But the broader picture Bashir constructed for Diana over the weeks that followed was one in which the entire institutional apparatus around her, the palace, its secretaries, its advisors, the people who briefed against her, and those who managed her formal life, was shot through with betrayal. She could not trust Jepson, Bashir told her. She could not trust the private secretaries in Charles's household. She could not trust the protection officers around her. And she could not trust the people inside Buckingham Palace who, according to the version of events Bashir was steadily building in her mind, were working to manage and diminish her rather than support her. Fellowes occupied exactly the position as the Queen's private secretary and Diana's brother-in-law simultaneously that this constructed narrative of institutional betrayal was designed to make toxic. He was not named on any forged document. He did not need to be. The entire architecture of Bashir's deception was built around the idea that proximity to the palace meant hostility to Diana, and no single figure in Diana's life combined palace proximity and family relationship more directly than the man who ran the Queen's office and had also watched Diana grow up in his wife's family. By the time Diana sat down for the Panorama interview in November 1995, whatever residual trust she had retained for the people inside Buckingham Palace, who also happened to be her family, had been systematically dismantled over months of meetings with a journalist who had started the process with forged paperwork. The Dyson report established this sequence with a precision that had not been available to anyone reading the story as it unfolded in 1995. At the time, the palace knew only that the interview had happened, that it had been conducted in absolute secrecy, and that the Queen's own private secretary, the man whose institutional job it was to know what was coming before it arrived, had been entirely blindsided. Fellows had spent 15 years building institutional systems designed to anticipate exactly this kind of threat. The interview bypassed every one of those systems because Diana had been persuaded, through a campaign of targeted misinformation, that the systems themselves were the threat. It was only after the Dyson report that the full picture became available. Fellows had been managing the fallout of an interview whose origin lay partly in a deliberate effort to make Diana distrust the very people whose job included looking out for her. He had not failed through negligence or institutional obtuseness alone. He had been, in a very specific sense, the target of a manipulation campaign he knew nothing about, conducted by a journalist who understood that destroying Diana's trust in the people around her was the most efficient route to getting her alone in a room with a BBC camera. The public response to the Dyson report's publication in May 2021 was dominated by two reactions. The BBC's then Director General Tim Davie issued a formal apology, stating that the process for securing the interview had fallen far short of what audiences had a right to expect, and accepting the report's findings in full. Prince William released a statement describing the interview as a program that exploited his mother's fears and that had no positive legacy. He said it had worsened his parents' relationship and contributed to his mother's isolation, and he called on the BBC to ensure that the falsified documents and Bashir's conduct never appeared in any future broadcasts. Prince Harry echoed these sentiments, saying the interview had effectively established a false narrative that had been used to manipulate his mother in her most vulnerable years. Neither William nor Harry mentioned Fellows in their statements. Neither needed to. The restoration of Fellows' institutional honor, if that is the right framing for what the inquiry accomplished, was implicit rather than explicit. The report confirmed that the interview had been obtained through deception. It confirmed that the deception had specifically targeted Diana's trust in the people around her. And it confirmed that the picture of Fellows that Diana's allies had maintained throughout the 1990s and beyond, the image of a cold institutional gatekeeper who had worked against her, was built on a foundation that included fabricated evidence designed by someone who wanted Diana isolated and cooperative. Patrick Jephson received the most direct vindication the inquiry produced for any individual. The BBC paid him a substantial sum in damages and apologized unreservedly for the serious harm caused to him. Jephson donated the entire amount to a Welsh children's hospice that Diana herself had supported during their years of working together, a gesture that said more about the kind of person he was than anything the corporation's settlement documents could convey. He later reflected publicly that the worst aspect of what Bashir had done was that Diana had gone to her death believing Jephson had betrayed her, a belief that now had to be understood not as Diana's own considered judgment, but as the product of a campaign of deliberate misinformation. Jephson's vindication was specific and documented. What the inquiry offered Fellows was subtler. His name appeared in the Dyson report, not as a victim of the deception, but as a peripheral figure in Bashir's construction of the environment around Diana, the Queen's man, the institution's representative, the brother-in-law whose professional position made him, in the narrative Bashir was building for Diana, inherently suspect, regardless of anything he had actually done. Fellows could not be compensated for a reputation that had been damaged without his name being attached to any specific fabrication. The damage had been done by implication rather than by document, which meant the restoration was also, necessarily, by implication rather than by formal apology. What the inquiry did confirm was something Fellows himself had never publicly disputed, but had also never been in a position to fully explain, that in November 1995, when the Panorama interview aired, he had been in the dark, not because he was incompetent or indifferent, but because Diana had been systematically persuaded to keep him in the dark. The architecture of secrecy surrounding the interview's preparation was not simply Diana exercising her autonomy, though it was that too. It was also the direct consequence of a months-long campaign to convince her that the people who might have warned her or helped her think through the consequences were the very people she could no longer afford to trust. The Tiggy Legbork episode, which the Dyson inquiry also examined, provided a specific instance of how this manipulation had intersected with Fellowes's professional responsibilities. Legborg was the nanny employed by Prince Charles to care for William and Harry during the periods they spent with their father. Bashir had, among the many lies he fed Diana over the months of their meetings, provided her with a fabricated document suggesting that Legborg had undergone an abortion of a child fathered by Charles. Diana had believed this. At a Christmas party in 1995, shortly after the interview aired, she had approached Legborg directly and made a comment about the supposed pregnancy that left Legborg devastated and publicly humiliated. Legborg had immediately sought legal advice and insisted that the matter be investigated. The investigation had fallen to Fellowes, in his capacity as the Queen's private secretary and the appropriate channel for exactly this kind of formal complaint within the royal household. He had looked into the allegation on her behalf and concluded, correctly, that it was without foundation. The Dyson inquiry confirmed years later that the fabricated document Bashir had given Diana was entirely invented. But, in 1995, what the episode produced for Fellowes was a formal complaint that required his time and attention, generated by a lie he had no way of knowing was a lie at the time, while the broader institutional crisis created by the interview itself was still consuming every other resource he had. The BBC's formal response to the Dyson report's publication included commitments that the interview would not be rebroadcast, that all awards the program had won would be returned, and that a sum of money representing the profits generated by the interview would be donated to charity. These were institutional gestures, important as signals of formal accountability, but unable to restore the specific human costs the interview had extracted from the people around Diana in the years between 1995 and 2021. For Fellowes, the inquiry's findings arrived in the final years of his life. He was 79 years old when the report was published. The 9 years he had spent in the private secretary's office had ended more than 2 decades earlier, and the specific crisis the report addressed had unfolded a quarter of a century before. Whatever relief the inquiry's conclusions may have offered him came attached to the awareness that the years during which a different understanding might have changed things most directly were long past. William's public statement following the inquiry's publication was, among other things, a careful piece of historical reframing. He described the program as having no positive legacy. He was specific about the mechanism. It had exploited his mother's vulnerabilities, made worse her isolation, damaged her relationships with the people who might have helped her. Those relationships included the one with her own sister's husband, the man running the institution that the interview had been designed to expose. William had grown up watching that relationship deteriorate from a position that gave him an unusual vantage point, close enough to see both sides of the damage, too young to do anything about it, and old enough, by 2021, to understand what the inquiry's findings meant for how the decade should actually be remembered. The Dyson report did not resolve every question the Panorama interview raised. It could not, because some of what happened in the months surrounding the interview remained genuinely unclear even after the inquiry's most thorough examination of the available evidence. What it did resolve was the question of how the interview had been obtained, and by resolving that question, it made a different kind of understanding available to anyone who wanted to look at the events of 1995 with the inquiry's findings in hand. Fellowes had spent years being characterized in certain accounts of the 1990s as someone who had failed Diana, whether through active institutional hostility or through the passive accumulation of professional priorities that left no room for her personal welfare. The Dyson report's findings did not directly address these characterizations because they addressed Bashir's conduct rather than the internal workings of the palace. But they did establish, with the authority of a formal judicial inquiry, that the specific episode that had most damaged Fellowes's standing in Diana's eyes, and in the eyes of everyone who accepted her perspective on the institution, had been engineered through deliberate deception rather than through any authentic failure of his own. That distinction arrived 26 years after the event. By the time it was publicly established, the decade it concerned had passed into history. Most of the people directly involved had moved on to entirely different lives, and Diana herself had been dead for nearly a quarter of a century. The inquiry could clarify what had happened. It could compensate the people who had been named in fabricated documents. It could require the BBC to return its awards and issue its apologies. What it could not do was give back the years during which a false version of events had been the only version most people knew. Fellows read the report's findings in the spring of 2021, in the same county of Norfolk where he had been born 8 decades earlier, 3 years before his own death, and a year before he would step down from the House of Lords. He said nothing publicly about what the inquiry had concluded. He had spent his entire adult life saying nothing publicly about the things that mattered most to him, and there was no reason to expect that the Dyson report would change a habit that had defined his character since long before the decade it was examining. The silence was, in its way, a final piece of evidence about who he was. A man seeking vindication would have spoken, a man who had spent 9 years learning that the value of institutional service depended precisely on not turning personal grievances into public statements, had, by the time the vindication arrived, long since stopped measuring its value against the costs it might have saved him. On October 26, 1999, Robert Fellows walked into the House of Lords and took his seat for the first time as Baron Fellows of Shocham in the county of Norfolk. The chamber he entered was itself in the middle of a transformation. The House of Lords Act 1999 had just cleared out the bulk of the hereditary peers who had sat there for generations, reducing the number entitled to remain from several hundred to 92, and replacing what had been an overwhelmingly conservative, dynastically constituted upper chamber with something more variously appointed and, in its own way, more uncertain about its own identity. The crossbenches where Fellows took his place had been growing in significance for years, precisely because the removal of hereditary peers had shifted the balance of power in the chamber toward independent members whose votes were not predictable by party affiliation. For a man who had spent his entire professional life managing relationships across political lines without declaring loyalty to any of them, the crossbench was the only place in British public life where the institutional culture matched what he had always been. The crossbench position meant something specific in the architecture of the Lords. Crossbenchers do not receive a party whip. They attend debates and vote according to their own judgment, which means that on any given division, their votes are genuinely unpredictable to party managers and genuinely sought by both sides. A crossbencher with specific expertise in constitutional matters, or in national security, or in financial regulation, is worth more to the chamber's deliberative function than a backbench party peer who votes the whip, regardless of what the debate contains. Fellows had spent 9 years at the intersection of constitutional monarchy, government communication, and institutional management at its most demanding. His value to the Lords' committee work was not ceremonial, it was substantive, and the committees he joined across 22 years reflected that. His first significant committee appointment came on June 28, 2001, when he joined the Lords' Constitution Committee, a posting he held until November 2004. The Constitution Committee is the Chamber's mechanism for examining the constitutional implications of legislation and other government proposals, and in the early years of Blair's government, it had more than enough material to work with. The Human Rights Act had come into force in October 2000, incorporating the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law and raising questions about the relationship between Parliament, the judiciary, and the executive that the committee was well placed to examine. Devolution had created Scottish and Welsh assemblies in 1999, fundamentally altering the constitutional map of the United Kingdom and producing a set of jurisdictional questions that had no clean historical precedents. These were exactly the kinds of institutional questions that Fellows had been navigating from inside the palace for a decade, where every major domestic development had to be assessed for its implications for the Crown's constitutional position. The Blair government's relationship with the palace during this period had its own distinctive texture. Fellows had been the man managing the palace's communications when Blair arrived at Downing Street in May 1997, and the 8 weeks between Blair's election and Diana's death had given Fellows just enough time to form a preliminary assessment of the new Prime Minister's team before the crisis that would define the relationship arrived. Blair's press operation, led by Alistair Campbell, worked at a speed and with a media fluency that the palace's own communications staff had no equivalent for. The People's Princess phrase that Blair delivered outside his constituency church on the morning of August 31st, 1997, was, among other things, a piece of political communication of a kind that the palace genuinely could not have produced in the same moment. It was direct, emotionally immediate, and it landed in the space between public grief and institutional silence, with a precision that defined the terms of the first week of mourning before the palace had fully understood what those terms were. By the time Fellows took his seat on the crossbenches in late 1999, Blair had been Prime Minister for 2.5 years, and his team had not entirely suppressed the view that Downing Street had saved the monarchy during the week of Diana's death. It was a view that people close to Blair repeated in various forms for years afterward, and it carried within it a specific implication that the palace's own management, under Fellows, had been slow, defensive, and unable to read the public mood without outside assistance. The criticism was not entirely wrong. The week of Diana's death had exposed real limits in the palace's instincts about public communication, but the credit Blair's team claimed was also somewhat overstated, in ways that people inside the palace never felt comfortable publicly disputing, because disputing them would have required a level of public self-justification that the institution was structurally opposed to. The Constitution Committee gave Fellows a forum adjacent to these questions, without requiring him to engage them personally. He could sit on a committee examining the constitutional implications of government proposals affecting the Crown, without anyone reasonably framing his participation as a rebuttal of specific criticisms. The committee work was impersonal by design. Its outputs were collective findings rather than individual statements, which suited a man whose entire career had been built around the discipline of not speaking for himself when he could speak for an institution. The Public Whip's record of Fellows' parliamentary voting shows a participation rate that reflects how crossbench peers typically use their membership, present and voting when the subject engaged his specific knowledge, absent when it did not. He attended 325 divisions out of 2,506 possible across his entire tenure, a rate of 13% that looks low by comparison with party peers but is consistent with crossbench patterns of selective, expert engagement rather than party discipline attendance. Within those 325 votes, he voted against the prevailing view on 96 occasions, a rebellion rate of just under 30%, which is high for any peer, and particularly striking for someone whose public reputation rested almost entirely on institutional loyalty. It meant that when he showed up and voted, he was not merely adding his name to whichever outcome his background might lead observers to expect. He was exercising genuine independent judgment, and more often than not, that judgment placed him at odds with the conventional position. He joined the Liaison Committee of the Lords in December 2008, a posting he held until May 2013. The Liaison Committee oversees the Lords' Select Committee work as a whole, ensuring that the Chamber's investigative resources are allocated to questions where detailed examination would actually improve legislation or inform policy. It is a meta-institutional role, a committee about how committees should function, which required the kind of structural thinking about how deliberative bodies operate that Fellows had spent decades applying inside the palace. He then joined the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, serving from February 2010 to May 2014, with a brief gap. The intersection of constitutional monarchy and national security had been a live professional concern throughout his time as private secretary, where every significant intelligence briefing that touched on threats to the Crown or to senior members of the royal family passed through his office, and where the relationship between the palace and the security services required constant management that most people outside a small Whitehall circle knew nothing about. The Financial Exclusion Committee, which he joined in May 2016 and served until March 2017, represents the most direct overlap between his banking career and his legislative work. The committee produced a report titled Tackling Financial Exclusion, a Country That Works for Everyone, examining the barriers that prevented significant portions of the British population from accessing basic financial services, from bank accounts to affordable credit. This was, on its face, the kind of work that looked surprising for a man who had spent his post-palace career as chairman of Barclays Private Banking, a division serving precisely the segment of the population furthest from financial exclusion. But Fellows had also spent 15 years before his palace career working in the technical machinery of Britain's money markets, and he had spent his post-palace years specifically engaged with prison reform and the Churchill Fellowship, both of which brought him into sustained contact with the social consequences of exactly the kind of economic exclusion the committee was examining. The combination gave him a perspective that straddled the institutional and the human dimensions of the problem in a way that neither a banker nor a campaigner alone could have provided. The 22 years Fellows spent in the Lords also coincided with the long, slow public rehabilitation of his professional reputation, though rehabilitation is perhaps too active a word for what was mostly a passive process of time making certain characterizations untenable. The decade of crisis had generated a version of Fellows that served the narrative needs of everyone trying to explain what had happened to Diana. He was the institution's man, cold and procedural, the human face of the machine that had ground her down. This version had some basis in structural reality. He had been the Queen's chief advisor. He had been required to treat the stability of the institution as his first professional obligation. He had, on specific occasions, made decisions that prioritized the Crown's interests over Diana's personal preferences, because that was precisely what his job required him to do. But the version that had hardened in the public account of the decade went further than the structural reality warranted, and it required a specific kind of selective memory to maintain. It required forgetting that he had spent 9 years watching his own wife's sister suffer in ways that his professional position prevented him from addressing directly. It required treating his institutional role as the complete account of his character, rather than as one dimension of a life that also included genuine personal relationships, genuine private concerns, and a post-palace public record that pointed rather obviously in the opposite direction from cold institutional self-interest. A man who devoted 15 years to prison reform after leaving the most prestigious civil position in the country is not easily characterized as someone indifferent to human suffering, even by people strongly motivated to maintain that characterization for other reasons. The House of Lords gave these competing versions of Fellows a kind of slow institutional resolution without ever requiring anyone to formally adjudicate between them. He served his committees, voted his conscience, and attended the kinds of formal occasions where the House's crossbench members gather: state openings, memorial services, the periodic ceremonial business of a chamber that still retained its role as the nation's most experienced deliberative body, despite everything that had been said about it over the preceding century. He attended Harry and Meghan's wedding in May 2018, an occasion that placed him physically at the center of the family story one more time, in a very different register from the occasions during the 1990s, when his presence had been required by institutional duty rather than chosen by personal affection. The Lords Constitution Committee work during Fellows' early years had touched, at various points, on questions about the monarchy's own constitutional position, how devolution affected the Crown's relationship with Scotland and Wales, how the Human Rights Act changed the framework within which royal prerogatives operated, how the relationship between the sovereign and the government should function in an era of more aggressive parliamentary scrutiny of executive power. These were not abstract questions for a man who had spent 9 years managing exactly those relationships from the inside. They were, in a very specific sense, the academic version of problems he had been solving empirically while in post, and his presence on the committee gave it access to a form of lived institutional knowledge that no other member could have provided. He never spoke publicly about how he understood his own contribution to these debates. The 2 recorded Hansard speeches from his early years in the Lords, one on the international situation in January 2000 and one on crime prevention in December 2004, are sparse enough to tell you almost nothing about his private views. His voting record tells you more, but even that requires interpretation. What can be said with confidence is that the man who sat on the Financial Exclusion Committee in 2016, examining the barriers that prevented the poorest Britons from accessing basic banking services, was drawing on a range of experience that his press coverage during the 1990s had never suggested existed. The technical banking knowledge from his years before the palace, the social conscience formed through prison reform work, and the structural understanding of how institutions fail the people they are supposed to serve that can only be acquired from years of watching the failure from the inside. He retired from the Lords on February 10, 2022, 7 months before the Queen died at Balmoral. The timing meant that his formal parliamentary career ended while she was still alive, and that his final years were spent in the private, irreducible connection of two people who had known each other for more than 80 years, without any institutional framework to give the relationship a formal name. By the time of his retirement from the Lords, he had served on 6 committees across a 22-year membership, had voted on 325 divisions, with a rebellion rate that suggested genuine rather than reflexive independence, and had accumulated a legislative record that sat in quiet, unmarked contrast to everything that had been written about him during the decade that defined his public reputation. The Lords produces no memoirs, no interview series, no authorized biographies of its members' service. Its work is documented in Hansard and in committee reports, and the people who do it are, by the culture of the chamber, expected to find their reward in the work rather than in the recognition. Fellows had been prepared for exactly this mode of service by every institution he had ever belonged to. Eton taught restraint, the Scots Guards taught hierarchy, the City taught patience with unglamorous technical work. The Palace taught the specific discipline of never appearing to matter more than the institution you served. The Lords, at the end of a life shaped by all of these, was simply the last institution in a long line of them, and he served it with the same quiet competence that had characterized everything that came before. When Charles Spencer posted his tribute to Robert Fellows on the morning of July 31, 2024, he described his brother-in-law as a total gentleman, in all the best meanings of that word, a man of humor, wisdom, and utter integrity. Spencer added that he was deeply proud to have been his brother-in-law. For anyone who had followed the story of the 1990s closely enough to know how bitter and contested those years had been, the tribute carried more weight than its brevity might suggest. This was the same man who had delivered a barely restrained funeral eulogy at Westminster Abbey in 1997, a speech widely understood as a pointed indictment of the institution Fellows had served, describing Diana as someone who needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic, words that had drawn applause from the crowds outside, loud enough to be heard inside the Abbey. 27 years later, the same Earl Spencer was calling the man who had run that institution during its worst decade a person of utter integrity, without qualification or caveat. The distance between those two moments is, in a compressed form, the full arc of how Robert Fellows came to be understood after the decade that had defined his reputation. The version of Fellows that took hold during the 1990s was produced under specific conditions that made balance almost structurally impossible. Diana was one of the most beloved public figures in the world, and she was manifestly suffering. The people responsible for managing the institution she was in conflict with needed faces and names, because suffering at the hands of abstract forces does not produce the narrative charge that suffering at the hands of identifiable people does. Fellows occupied the most identifiable position in the institutional machinery, the Queen's chief advisor, the man whose desk every difficult decision crossed, the man who happened also to be Diana's brother-in-law, which gave his institutional role a personal dimension that made him far more useful to the emerging story than any other courtier could have been. He became, in the accounts of people close to Diana, the human face of everything that had been done to her, whether or not the specific decisions they attributed to him were ones he had actually made, or made for the reasons they assumed. Tina Brown's 2022 book, The Palace Papers, offered one of the more measured assessments of Fellows available in any major account of the period. Brown, who had known the royal world well enough to write Diana's most detailed biography before turning to the broader palace story, documented both dimensions of his position with unusual even-handedness. She described Jane as the Spencer sister who became a steady presence in William and Harry's lives, hosting them on country weekends in Norfolk with their cousins, and noted that thanks to her marriage to Fellows, Jane was almost a Windsor by osmosis. That phrase, Windsor by osmosis, captured precisely the ambiguity of Fellows' position throughout the decade, connected to the institution by professional obligation, connected to Diana's family by marriage, and unable to fully satisfy either side's expectations of him as a result. Brown also documented the episode that ended his tenure in ways that revealed something important about how the fault lines of the late 1990s actually ran. According to Brown, a Mail on Sunday article had appeared, accusing Fellows of being one of the prime instruments in the destruction of the monarchy's public esteem. The article struck him as a deliberate attack rather than an honest journalistic assessment, and he blamed it on Mark Bolland, who had joined Charles's household as Deputy Private Secretary in 1997, and who, according to Brown's account, shared the Prince of Wales's conviction that Fellows was the major blockade in Buckingham Palace's acceptance of Camilla. The allegation was specific, that Fellows, still operating from a position of institutional loyalty to the Queen rather than to Charles's personal agenda, was slowing down the rehabilitation campaign Bolland had been hired to run. The Bolland-Fellows tension illuminates something about the late 1990s that gets lost in the broader narrative of the Diana decade. By 1998 and 1999, the immediate crisis had passed. Diana was dead. The divorce was long settled. The monarchy had survived the extraordinary week of public grief that had followed the accident in Paris, and had even, through the Golden Jubilee years that followed, regained much of the popular affection it had appeared to be losing. The new battle, the one Bolland had been specifically hired to fight, was about Camilla. Could she be brought into public acceptance as Charles's partner? Could the remarriage that would eventually happen in 2005 be made politically and publicly viable? Fellows had a view on this question, and it was not Bolland's view. His position, consistent with the Queen's own instincts throughout this period, was that the pace of Camilla's rehabilitation needed to be managed carefully, that public acceptance built too quickly on a foundation of coordinated press management was less stable than acceptance earned over time through genuine public exposure. This was not an argument that Charles's household found useful, because it prioritized institutional patience over the urgent rehabilitation campaign Bolland had been tasked with delivering. The conflict was real, and it was professional rather than personal, though once Bolland was identified as the probable source of the Mail on Sunday piece that accused Fellows of destroying the monarchy's public standing. The distinction between professional and personal became harder to maintain. Fellows left his post in February 1999. The Queen gave him his life peerage in July of that year, the most direct form of institutional recognition she could offer, without making a public speech in his defense. She did not make a public speech in his defense. The Queen did not make public speeches in defense of the people she trusted, because the act of defending them publicly would have required her to engage with the criticisms publicly, which would have required exactly the kind of open institutional conflict she had spent 70 years learning to avoid. The peerage was her statement, delivered in the language she had always used, form and title, and the quiet bestowal of permanent status, rather than words. What the historical record shows, when examined across the whole span of his career, rather than through the narrow window of the Diana decade alone, is a man whose private judgments were generally more accurate than the public characterizations of him acknowledged. He was right that the Morton book, once in print, could not be managed as ordinary tabloid speculation. He was right that Diana's cooperation with it, once suspected, would eventually be confirmed, and that the palace's initial dismissal would look embarrassing in retrospect. He was right that the income tax and Buckingham Palace visitor reforms were necessary to the institution's long-term survival, even when traditional courtiers argued against them. He was right that the pace of Camilla's rehabilitation required more patience than Bolland was prepared to allow. And he was right, in the specific and still largely unacknowledged sense revealed by the Dyson inquiry 22 years later, that what happened in November 1995 was not a straightforward exercise of Diana's autonomy, but something substantially more complicated, involving deliberate manipulation of people close to her in ways that would not be fully understood for decades. None of this makes Fellows' record without blemish. The institution he served failed Diana in ways that cannot be fully attributed to outside manipulation, and he was the chief officer of that institution during the years when the most damaging failures occurred. The Queen herself understood this, in the private, unsentimental way that characterized her assessments of even the people she most trusted. She retained Fellows as an extra equerry and invited him to occasions that mattered to her personally, but she never publicly revised the historical record on his behalf, because revising the historical record publicly would have required reopening questions about the institution's conduct that she had decided to leave closed. The people who worked alongside Fellows during the crisis years offered a consistent portrait across the accounts that appeared in print after his death. Robert Lacey, whose research for Battle of Brothers had taken him deep into the palace's internal dynamics during the late 1990s, documented the confrontation between Fellows and Charles on the night of Diana's death, without framing it as evidence of Fellows's callousness. The arrangement of Diana's body, which had triggered Charles's explosion, was made on the Queen's explicit instructions rather than Fellows's own initiative, a fact that the various accounts which reproduced Charles's outburst sometimes omitted. Fellows was the person Charles shouted at, because Fellows was the person in the corridor who was managing the practical decisions of an institution in crisis. Being the person who carried out instructions and received the anger they generated was, in the most fundamental sense, exactly what the job had always required of him. The Crown, which introduced a dramatized version of Fellows played by Andrew Havill in its 5th and 6th seasons, faced the challenge that all dramatizations of this period face. The most accurate representation of Fellows's position is also the least dramatically useful one. A man who was neither villain nor hero, who occupied an institutionally defined role that constrained every personal impulse, who exercised professional judgment under conditions of genuine dual loyalty without ever fully satisfying either side, does not make for the kind of television that requires clean moral architecture. The Crown's Fellows was accordingly simplified in ways that served the drama's needs rather than the historical record, which is the usual fate of minor characters in major dramatizations, and Fellows himself never made any public comment about how he was portrayed. Royal biographer Sarah Bradford, writing in the context of the Queen's full life and reign, rather than the Diana decade specifically, placed Fellows within a line of private secretaries whose collective contribution to the monarchy's survival across the 20th century deserves more recognition than it typically receives. Bradford's view, shared by several historians who have examined the period closely, is that the institution's survival through the 1990s, which looked far from certain during the worst of the crisis years, required precisely the kind of steady, undramatic, institution-first competence that Fellows provided. Not the charisma of a reformer, not the boldness of someone who could rewrite the rules visibly and claim credit for it, but the grinding, thankless capacity to keep the machinery running when every element of the environment was working against it. The posthumous reassessment that began appearing in the days after his death on July 29, 2024, was notable for several things it did not contain. It did not contain the accusation that he had worked against Diana, which had been a reliable feature of coverage that mentioned him at all throughout the 1990s and 2000s. It did not contain the implication that his institutional loyalty amounted to indifference to human suffering, an implication that his post-palace record of prison reform work and social engagement had made increasingly difficult to sustain. What it did contain, from the BBC, from The Times, from Newsweek, from People, and from Spencer's own tribute, was a consistent portrait of a man who had handled an impossible position with more decency than the public narrative had previously allowed him credit for. Charles Spencer's description of Fellows as a total gentleman required no qualification because no qualification was needed. Spencer had been at the center of every significant moment of the Diana decade alongside Fellows. At the 1997 funeral, where his eulogy had implicitly criticized the institution Fellows ran, at the subsequent years of legal battles over Diana's estate and memory, at the Dyson inquiry, which had confirmed that Spencer himself had been deceived by Bashir, using Spencer's trust as the mechanism for gaining access to his sister, and at Snettisham Church in August 2024, where he and the man who had run the Queen's office through the worst years of all of their lives were together for the last time. Whatever bitterness or blame the 1990s had produced, Spencer's tribute suggested it had not survived the full span of the intervening decades intact. William and Harry had both showed up at Snettisham, as previously covered. But what the funeral also revealed was the texture of what their relationship with their uncle had actually been, as distinct from what their relationship with the institution he represented had become. Tina Brown's account of their childhood in the palace papers described Jane as the Spencer relative, who became most consistently present in their lives after Diana's death, hosting them in Norfolk while they processed the grief and disorientation that came with losing their mother at 15 and 12. The Norfolk holidays meant that the Fellows' household, Jane and Robert and their 3 children Laura, Alexander and Eleanor, had been the most sustained point of contact William and Harry had with the Spencer side of their family through the years of their adolescence. The man they came to bury in August 2024 had been part of their childhood in a way that went well beyond the formal connection of uncle by marriage. The fact that they sat apart at the service, that the rift between them had grown deep enough that a family funeral could not overcome it even temporarily, was a reminder that the fractures running through this family were not Fellows' legacy. They predated him, and they survived him. But the fact that both of them came, across the complication of Harry's security dispute, and the cost of a transatlantic flight, and the certain knowledge that their presence together would generate press coverage neither of them had invited, said something about what his place in their lives had actually been. They came because he was their uncle, and because in the private register that exists below the public story of any family, that relationship had been real rather than merely formal. There is a specific kind of historical figure that every era produces in some quantity but almost never properly accounts for. The person who stands at the center of events that will be remembered for generations, manages those events with more competence than the public record acknowledges, and then departs the scene without leaving a document that future historians can use as a primary source. Their absence from the written record is itself a product of the qualities that made them effective. The discipline that kept them useful while the crisis lasted keeps them invisible once it ends. Robert Fellows was this kind of figure, and understanding what his life actually meant requires looking past the story about him that the decade he served generated, toward the longer, quieter record that only became fully visible after he was gone. The story that the 1990s generated about Fellows was, in the most basic sense, a side effect of proximity. He was the closest institutional figure to Diana's life, who also had a face and a title the press could attach to the machinery of the crown. He occupied the role that the narrative of Diana's suffering required to function dramatically, the gatekeeper, the man between the woman the public loved and the institution that had failed her. That role was not entirely fictional. He ran the institution during the years it failed her. He made decisions in his professional capacity that prioritized the Crown's interests over her personal welfare, because the Crown's interests were precisely what his job required him to prioritize. None of this is in dispute. What is in dispute, and what the accumulation of evidence across the quarter-century following the crisis years gradually resolved, was the gap between what the role required and what the man inside the role was actually like. The man who ran the institution was simultaneously the man who had watched Diana grow up in his wife's family, who had sat at family tables with her, who had held professional opinions about her situation that he was never at liberty to share with the person most affected by them. Fellows was not indifferent to Diana's suffering. He was professionally constrained from acting on his awareness of it in any way that would have compromised his institutional loyalty, and in an institution whose entire operating logic rested on the premise that loyalty to the Crown came first. That constraint was not an exception or a failure of personal character. It was the condition of the job itself, accepted with full awareness by every man who had ever held it. The Queen died at Balmoral on September 8, 2022, 7 months after Fellows had stepped down from the House of Lords. He was 80 years old when she died, and the connection between them, which had begun when she visited the Fellows family on the Sandringham estate 8 decades earlier, ended on a September afternoon in Scotland, without anyone in the room who had known her as long as he had. His retirement from the Lords in February 2022 had been a quiet, administrative end to a parliamentary career of 22 years. A letter submitted, a name removed from the register, no ceremony. 7 months later, the person whose life had given his own professional life, its meaning and its shape, was gone. The nature of what they had shared, the Queen and Fellows, resists easy description because it combined institutional and personal dimensions that the official account of either life could never fully capture. She had trusted him with the worst years of her reign. He had carried that trust without breaking under it, which was not an achievement he had sought public credit for, but which was, by any honest measure, genuinely difficult. The institution had asked him to manage a crisis involving his own family. He had managed it as well as anyone in his position could have, and he had done so without producing a single public statement that could fairly be characterized as self-serving, which is a record that very few people involved in the same crisis could match. What the institution inherited from his 9 years in the private secretary's office was something that no successor could fully replicate, but all of them built upon. Robin Janvrin, who took over in February 1999 and served until September 2007, inherited an office that had already been forced through the changes that the 1990s crisis had required. The income tax reform and the Buckingham Palace visitor program, both of which Fellows had pushed through against traditionalist resistance, were in place. The institutional habit of silence in the face of media scrutiny, which the crisis had exposed as no longer sufficient, had been partially replaced by something more responsive, less automatic in its assumption that dignity required saying nothing. The Way Ahead group, which Fellows had participated in throughout his tenure, had established a framework for the family and senior advisors to discuss modernization in a structured way rather than waiting for each new crisis to force change. Janvrin's tenure, which included the death of the Queen Mother in 2002, the Golden Jubilee celebrations of the same year, and the managed public introduction of Camilla as Charles's eventual consort, was built on a foundation that Fellows had laid under conditions far more difficult than anything Janvrin faced. The institutional knowledge Fellows had accumulated across 9 years of crisis did not disappear when he walked out of Buckingham Palace in February 1999. It passed into the permanent memory of an institution whose capacity to absorb and retain such knowledge across individual tenures is, perhaps, its most underappreciated characteristic. The broader question of what the monarchy learned from the decade Fellows managed has been asked, in various forms, by royal historians since the crisis years ended. The answer the evidence supports is more complicated than either of the simple versions. Neither that the institution learned nothing and reverted to its pre-crisis habits, nor that the crisis produced a clean, durable modernization that resolved the fundamental tensions the 1990s had exposed. What actually happened was something more typically institutional, partial adaptation, some lessons embedded and some forgotten, with the balance shifting depending on who was in the key positions at any given moment. The fractures that Fellows had spent 9 years trying to contain did not close when he left. The relationship between Charles's household and the Queen's remained uneasy throughout the Bolland years. William and Harry's public rupture, which consumed the family in the early 2020s, produced a set of grievances rooted in exactly the same structural tensions that had defined the 1990s. The gap between the institution's public face and the private reality of the people living inside it, the competing demands of institutional loyalty and personal welfare, the impossibility of maintaining both simultaneously under the pressure of global media scrutiny. Harry's memoir, Spare, described a palace apparatus in terms that recalled the accounts Diana's allies had given of the 1990s, substituting new names for old ones, but preserving the essential architecture of the complaint, an institution that protected itself at the expense of the people nominally within its protection. Whether this reading is accurate in Harry's case is a question that will be argued for years. What is certain is that the structural conditions it describes, the ones that made Fellows' position so difficult for so long, did not change simply because the specific people involved had changed. The Crown's requirement to subordinate individual welfare to institutional stability, the press's appetite for exactly the conflicts that requirement generates, and the impossibility of managing either of those realities without becoming, in somebody's account, the villain of the story, are not problems that any specific reform resolves. They are permanent features of the relationship between a hereditary institution and the modern world, and they will produce their own versions of the Diana decade again, and again, and again, for as long as the institution exists. Fellows understood this. His silence, which persisted through every subsequent controversy about the period he had managed, was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who understood, through long experience, that speaking would accomplish nothing beyond satisfying his own desire to be correctly understood. The institution was more important than his reputation within it. That was the operating principle he had accepted when he joined the royal household in 1977, and it was the operating principle he honored until the day he died. He died at home in Norfolk, the county he had been born in, on July 29, 2024. The brief official notice gave no cause of death. He would have found the absence of explanation appropriate. He had spent 82 years declining to explain himself in public, and the final piece of information about him that reached the press arrived in exactly the form he would have chosen. The tributes that appeared in the days following his death were, collectively, a more accurate account of who he was than anything published during his professional life. The Times ran an obituary that described him as stalwart, a word with specifically English connotations of reliable, unglamorous steadiness that fits better than any of the alternatives available. The BBC described him as the most senior official in the monarch's household, a man who had helped steer the royal family through a turbulent period, language that is accurate if deliberately understated. Earl Spencer's tribute, which called him a total gentleman of humour, wisdom and utter integrity, carried the weight of something personally felt rather than diplomatically offered. What none of the tributes fully captured, because what they were capturing was not amenable to the conventions of the tribute form, was the specific texture of a life built entirely around service to something larger than itself. Fellows had been born on royal land, educated at an institution designed to produce men suitable for exactly the kind of role he eventually held, shaped by the military and the city, and then by the longest sustained crisis in the modern monarchy's history, and he had emerged from all of it with his private judgment and his private values essentially intact. The man who devoted 15 years after leaving the palace to prison reform and to supporting young people using the Churchill Fellowship's grants to study the world's problems was not performing a conversion from institutional conservatism to progressive social concern. He was expressing, for the first time in his adult life, values that his professional role had prevented him from acting on directly. Jane remained in Norfolk after his death, the surviving centre of a family story that had begun in 1941 and had reached across 8 decades of British history, touching everything that had mattered in that history at its most compressed and consequential. She had attended Lilibet's christening in California the previous year, traveling to Harry's side of the world in a gesture of consistent family connection that her husband, for all his public constraints, had supported throughout the years of the brothers' estrangement. She had delivered the reading at Harry's wedding in 2018. She had buried her sister's body in Paris in 1997. She had stood at her own wedding in 1978, while a 17-year-old Diana watched from among the bridesmaids, and none of them had any way of knowing what was coming. The story of Robert Fellowes, properly told, is not primarily the story of a man who failed Diana, or the story of a man who saved the monarchy, or the story of a courtier whose institutional loyalty overrode his human sympathies. It is the story of a man who found himself, through the specific accident of birth and marriage and career, standing at the point where the most powerful institution in British public life and the most beloved woman in the world were pulling in opposite directions, and who tried, for 9 years, to hold both things at once without fully succeeding at either. He was born on royal land in the middle of a war, held as an infant by the woman who would become his employer, educated for a world that no longer fully existed by the time he entered it, and sent into the worst decade of the modern monarchy without a playbook adequate to what the decade required. He adapted as best he could. He pushed the institution toward changes it resisted. He managed crises that his predecessors had not been trained to face, and that his successors inherited in a form slightly less dangerous than the one he had received. He lost his sister-in-law to a Paris tunnel, buried her in front of the largest television audience in human history, and went back to work the following week. He never wrote a book. He never gave a lengthy interview. He never appeared on a documentary and looked into a camera and explained what it had all felt like from the inside. He carried the knowledge of what he had seen and done for the remaining 27 years of his life in the county where he had been born, and when he died, the institution he had served was still standing, which was, in the specific sense that had always defined his profession, the only measure of success that had ever mattered to him.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.